Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most peculiar social labyrinths, a world where simply saying hello to the wrong person could destroy your entire future. Imagine this. You are standing in a crowded ballroom, music swirling around you, and across the room you see someone fascinating. Your eyes meet. They smile. You smile back. And then you do absolutely nothing. Because in Regency England, that is exactly what survival required. So before we explore this strange and wonderful world together, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying these late-night historical journeys with me, could you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like? And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now as you're listening to this? Are you tucked in bed with the lights down low? Maybe you are listening during a quiet evening commute. Drop a comment and let me know. I love imagining all of you out there sharing this moment with me. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights a little more, let the world outside fade away, and let us step back in time together. Picture yourself in Bath, England. The year is 1815. You are a young woman. Let us call you Miss Catherine after one of Jane Austen's most beloved heroines. You've just arrived in this glittering spa town with your guardian, Mrs. Allen, a kind but rather scattered woman who talks endlessly about muslin and the price of ribbons. Tonight is your very first ball at the upper assembly rooms, and you are vibrating with excitement. You've never seen anything like this in your life. The upper rooms blaze with candlelight from massive chandeliers. The air smells of perfume, powder, and the faint sweetness of the ratafia being served in delicate glasses. Ladies glide past in gowns of silk and satin, pale blues, soft pinks, ivory whites that seem to glow in the flickering light. The gentlemen are equally magnificent in their tailcoats and knee breeches, their cravats tied in intricate knots that probably took their valets an hour to perfect. The musicians are tuning up. A country dance is about to begin. Your heart is pounding. This is it. Your entrance into society. Your chance to dance, to laugh, to be part of this magical world. But here is the problem. The music starts. Couples are forming. And you cannot dance. Not because you do not know how, not because you are injured or ill. You cannot dance because you do not know anyone. And Mrs. Allen, your supposed guide into this glittering world, looks around the room and realizes with growing horror that she does not recognize a single soul either. "I wish you could dance, my dear," Mrs. Allen says, for perhaps the 15th time. "I wish you could get a partner." And you stand there watching, just watching. Because in Regency England you cannot simply walk up to that handsome young man by the pillar and introduce yourself. You cannot catch the eye of a potential dance partner and nod encouragingly. You cannot do anything at all. Without a proper introduction, you are invisible. You are a ghost at your own ball. And this, my friends, is where our story really begins. The system of introductions in Regency England was not just a quaint custom or a bit of old-fashioned politeness. It was a fortress, a moat, a drawbridge that could slam shut in an instant, leaving you on the wrong side of society forever. And the rules governing who could meet whom, when and how were so intricate, so precise, that entire guidebooks were published just to help people navigate them without destroying their reputations. Dr. John Trussler, a clergyman and etiquette expert, published his famous guide, A System of Etiquette, in 1805. It became a bestseller. And when you read it today, you realize that these people were essentially playing a high-stakes game where one wrong move could end you. Trussler writes, "To introduce persons who have not been properly introduced is a great breach of etiquette." Notice that word, properly. Not just introduced, properly introduced, because there was a right way and about 17,000 wrong ways to do this. Let us talk about why this mattered so much. In a society without social media, without background checks, without any easy way to verify who someone actually was, introductions served as a verification system. When Mrs. Smith introduced Miss Jones to Lady Thompson, Mrs. Smith was essentially vouching for Miss Jones. She was saying, this person is safe, this person is respectable, this person can be allowed into your social circle without bringing scandal or disaster. It was LinkedIn recommendations meets security clearance meets social credit score, all rolled into one. But here is where it gets beautifully complicated. Not all introductions were created equal. The rules changed depending on whether you were introducing two women, two men, or, heaven help you, a man and a woman. They changed based on age, based on social rank, based on whether you were in a ballroom on the street or in someone's drawing room, and they absolutely changed based on whether the people involved were married or single. Because remember, in this world, an unmarried woman's reputation was literally her most valuable possession. It determined whether she could make a good marriage. And marriage determined, well, pretty much everything else about her life. So when young Catherine Morland stands in that ballroom in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, unable to dance because she lacks the proper connections, Austen is not just showing us a girl having a boring evening. She is showing us a system of social control so powerful that it could physically prevent you from participating in society. Catherine has two working legs, a brain, and a genuine desire to dance. But none of that matters. She needs the magic key that only the right person can provide. A proper introduction. Enter the Master of Ceremonies. Now, this is where things get interesting. The Master of Ceremonies, often called the MC, was one of the few people who could break through the introduction barrier. In spa towns like Bath, the MC was an official position. This person had the authority to introduce anyone to anyone else, regardless of whether they had mutual acquaintances. He was like a universal key that could unlock any social door. But even the MC had rules. According to the customs of the assembly rooms, he could only introduce people for the specific purpose of dancing, just dancing, not for general conversation, not for potential courtship, not for anything beyond the immediate chaperoned, time-limited interaction of a country dance. The MC in Bath was essentially running a very polite, very formal speed dating service, except nobody called it dating, and if you even suggested such a thing, you would probably be asked to leave. When fortune finally smiles on Catherine and the MC introduces her to Henry Tilney, that clever, charming young man who will eventually capture her heart. It happens in the lower rooms on her second night in Bath. Jane Austen writes, "The Master of the Ceremonies introduced to her a very gentlemanlike young man as a partner. His name was Tilney." That is it. That is the whole introduction, but it is enough. The gates have opened. Catherine and Henry can now dance together. They can converse during the dance. And here is the beautiful part. Once they have been properly introduced by the MC, they can acknowledge each other in public from that point forward. They have graduated from strangers to acquaintances. The magic has happened. But what about people who did not have a master of ceremonies to help them? What about daily life in London, in the country estates, in the small villages scattered across England? This is where the rules became even more intricate. Generally speaking, the person of lower social rank could not introduce themselves to someone of higher rank. They had to wait to be introduced by a mutual acquaintance. But who decided who was higher or lower? Well, there was a whole system for that too. The aristocracy had it relatively easy. If you were a duke, everyone was below you except other dukes and the royal family. If you were a baron, you knew exactly where you stood in the pecking order. But for the vast middle and upper middle classes, the gentry, the professional families, the newly wealthy merchants trying to break into society, the hierarchy was murkier. Are you higher in status than the lawyer's daughter because your father owns more land? Or is she higher because her family is older, even if poorer? These questions kept people up at night, and heaven help you if you got it wrong. If you introduce someone to a person of higher rank without permission, you were essentially forcing that higher rank person to acknowledge someone they might not want to know. You were using your social capital to give someone else a boost they had not earned. This was considered incredibly rude. It was like hijacking someone's Instagram account to promote your friend's business, a violation of trust and boundaries. There is a wonderful moment in another Austen novel, Persuasion, where you see this dynamic play out. Sir Walter Elliot is obsessed with the baronetage, a book that lists all the aristocratic families in England in order of rank. When his cousin, Lady Dalrymple, arrives in Bath, Sir Walter is beside himself with excitement. Why? Because Lady Dalrymple outranks him. If he can re-establish their family connection, he can use her name to elevate his own social standing. So he leaves his card at her house. He waits anxiously. Will she return his call? Will she acknowledge the relationship? When her card finally arrives at his lodgings, he is triumphant. The introduction, or in this case the reintroduction, has been successful. The gate is open. But what about situations where introductions were impossible? This happened more often than you might think. Imagine you are at a country house party. You're walking through the gardens and you encounter another guest, someone you have not yet been introduced to. You cannot simply nod and say lovely weather. That would be speaking to a stranger, highly improper. So you do this incredibly awkward thing, you pretend you have not seen them. You look at the roses with sudden intense interest. You adjust your bonnet. You do anything except acknowledge the other person's existence, and they do the same thing back to you. Two people, 10 feet apart, both pretending the other is invisible. Now imagine this. You are that same woman, walking in the garden, but this time you encounter a man you have not been introduced to. The rules are even stricter now, because an introduction between a man and a woman of marriageable age was not just about social standing. It was about protecting reputations, preventing scandal, and controlling who had access to whom in the marriage market. An unmarried woman could not speak to an unmarried man unless a proper introduction had been made by someone trustworthy. And even then, they probably needed a chaperone present. We will talk more about chaperones later, trust me, but for now, just know that the introduction was only the first lock on a door with many locks. Men had slightly more freedom, but not much. A gentleman could be introduced to a lady only if certain conditions were met. First, there had to be a person of good standing willing to make the introduction. Second, the lady, or more accurately the lady's mother or guardian, had to consent to the introduction. Consent could be given explicitly or implicitly through body language and social cues. A mother might turn toward the introducer and smile, indicating her approval, or she might turn away, indicating that no, thank you, we are not interested in knowing that person, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The gate stayed closed. Dr. Trussler was very clear about this. He wrote that a gentleman must never presume to introduce himself to a lady, no matter how compelling his reasons, even if he had something important to tell her, even if he had saved her life for heaven's sake. The proper course was to find a mutual acquaintance, explain the situation, and ask that person to perform the introduction according to the rules, because the rules were more important than efficiency, more important than common sense, more important even than gratitude. I want you to think about that for a moment. A man rescues a woman from a runaway horse. She is shaken but grateful. She wants to thank him. He wants to make sure she's all right. But unless they happen to have a mutual friend standing nearby who can perform introductions, they cannot even have a proper conversation. They are trapped by the rules, and most of the time they followed them. Because the alternative, being labelled as someone who did not follow the rules, was worse than any temporary inconvenience. This system created some genuinely bizarre situations. There are accounts of people attending the same social events for months, seeing each other constantly but never speaking because no one had introduced them. They would know each other's names. They would know each other's families. They might even live on neighbouring estates. But without that formal introduction, they remained strangers. It was like having a Facebook friend request that sits in limbo forever, except instead of just being mildly annoying, it actually prevented you from having any interaction whatsoever. And here is what makes this both funny and a little bit sad. Everyone knew it was ridiculous. Dr. Trussler himself, in his etiquette guide, essentially admits that many of these rules are absurd. He writes, "There is no living well in society without submitting to, and falling in with, the forms of it, absurd as many of them may be." He knows it is absurd. Everyone knows it is absurd, but they do it anyway, because the alternative is chaos. The alternative is a world where anyone can walk up to anyone else and demand their time and attention. And for a society obsessed with order, hierarchy and control, that was unthinkable. So what happened to people who broke the rules? Well, it depended on who they were and how badly they broke them. A young woman who introduced herself to a man without proper authorization would be considered bold at best, scandalous at worst. She might be gossiped about. Invitations might stop coming. Mothers might steer their sons away from her. Men might assume she was fast, a Regency term for a woman who was too forward, too flirtatious, too available. And once you had that reputation, it was nearly impossible to shake it off. Men who broke the rules faced consequences too, though often less severe. A gentleman who introduced himself to a lady without permission might be considered presumptuous or ill-bred. People would whisper that he did not know the rules, which meant he probably was not properly educated, which meant he probably was not from a good family, which meant he was probably not someone you wanted your daughter to know. It was a downward spiral. One small mistake and suddenly people were questioning everything about you. But there were always rebels. There had to be. And this is where some of the best stories come from. Because when you create rules that strict, you create people who delight in breaking them, or at least bending them, or finding creative loopholes that technically follow the letter of the law while completely violating the spirit of it. And those people, those clever, creative rule benders, they are the ones who make history interesting. There is a reason Jane Austen's novels are full of introduction scenes. They were dramatic moments, high stakes. Would the introduction happen or not? Would the mother approve? Would the potential suitor pass muster? These were the questions that kept readers turning pages, because everyone knew what an introduction meant. It was not just two people meeting, it was a door opening, a possibility being created, a future being set in motion, or, if the introduction was refused, a door slamming shut, a possibility being destroyed, a future being denied. And that brings us back to poor Catherine Morland, standing in the assembly rooms, watching everyone else dance. When Henry Tilney is finally introduced to her, it is not just a moment of social victory, it is the beginning of her story. Because without that introduction, none of the rest of the novel can happen. She and Henry cannot have their witty conversations. They cannot go on walks together. They cannot fall in love. The introduction is not just a formality. It is the key that unlocks everything else. So the next time you walk up to someone at a party and say, "Hi, I am Sarah. I want you to appreciate what a radical act that is." You've just done something that would have been unthinkable to most people in 1815. You've introduced yourself. You've crossed a boundary that used to be heavily guarded. You have exercised a freedom that Jane Austen's characters could only dream about. And honestly, that's pretty amazing. But we are just getting started. Because the introduction was only the first test. Once you'd been properly introduced to someone, a whole new set of rules kicked in. Rules about how to acknowledge them on the street, how to address them in conversation, when you could visit them, how long you could stay. The introduction got you through the door, but surviving what came next, that required a whole different skill set. And that's exactly where we are heading next, into the peculiar and absolutely fascinating world of cutting. Because in Regency England, there was one social weapon so powerful, so devastating, that even the memory of it could make grown adults break out in a cold sweat. The art of pretending someone did not exist. The deadly crime of ignoring someone you had already been introduced to. Stay with me as we explore how a simple turn of the head could end a friendship, destroy a reputation, and occasionally start a duel. Trust me, you do not want to miss this. So you have made it through the introduction gauntlet. Congratulations, someone has vouched for you, the gates have opened, and you are now officially acquainted with another person. You can acknowledge them in public. You can engage in polite conversation. You've crossed from stranger to acquaintance. But here is what nobody warns you about. Now that you know this person, you cannot simply unknow them, and if you try, well, that is when things get truly dangerous. Let me tell you about something called cutting. And no, I am not talking about what your mind might jump to in modern terms. In Regency England, cutting someone meant something very specific and absolutely devastating. It meant deliberately ignoring someone you'd already been properly introduced to, pretending they did not exist, looking right through them as if they were made of glass. And in a society where reputation was everything, being cut by someone, especially someone of importance, could be social suicide. Now, before we dive deeper into this fascinating darkness, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had that experience where you see someone you know, maybe from work or school, and you both kind of pretend you did not see each other? Maybe you were both too tired to make small talk. Maybe things were awkward between you. Whatever the reason, you just let that moment pass without acknowledgement. Hold on to that feeling. Because in Regency England, that tiny uncomfortable moment could destroy your entire life. And I am not exaggerating even a little bit. The rules around cutting were bizarrely specific. First and most importantly, only women could cut people. Men, according to the strict social codes of the time, were not permitted to cut anyone, ever. If a gentleman saw someone he had been introduced to, he had to acknowledge them, a bow, a tip of the hat, something. It did not matter if he despised that person. It did not matter if that person owed him money or had insulted his sister or had spread vicious gossip about his family. A gentleman bowed. That was the rule. But women had power here. They could choose to cut someone, and when they did, it sent a message that echoed through drawing rooms and ballrooms across England. It said, "This person is beneath my notice. This person has done something so terrible that I refuse to acknowledge their existence." And everyone who witnessed the cut would know something scandalous had happened. They might not know what exactly, but they would know that someone had fallen from grace. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually played out. Imagine you are walking down Milsom Street in Bath on a sunny afternoon. You are with your mother doing some shopping, looking at ribbons and gloves in the shop windows. Coming toward you on the same side of the street is Mrs. Thompson, a woman you met at a card party 2 weeks ago. You had a pleasant conversation. You discussed the weather, the upcoming assembly, the shocking price of tea. She seemed perfectly friendly. You have every reason to believe that when you pass her today, you will exchange polite greetings and perhaps pause for a moment of pleasant small talk. But as you draw closer, something strange happens. Mrs. Thompson's eyes slide right past you, not over your head, not to the side, through you, as if you are a pane of glass. Her gaze goes to the shop window behind you, then to her own daughter walking beside her. She says something to her daughter and they both laugh, and then they walk right past you. No nod, no smile, no acknowledgement whatsoever. You've just been cut. Your heart drops into your stomach, your face burns, because everyone on that street saw what just happened. The milliner in the shop doorway, the other ladies walking by, the gentleman climbing into his carriage across the street. They all saw Mrs. Thompson cut you dead, and now they're going to wonder what did you do? What scandal are you involved in? What terrible secret are you hiding that made Mrs. Thompson, perfectly respectable Mrs. Thompson, decide you were not worthy of acknowledgement? This is the genius and the cruelty of cutting. It did not require explanation. It did not need justification. The act itself was the punishment. And because nobody knew exactly why you were cut, they could imagine anything. Maybe you said something inappropriate. Maybe you behaved badly at a party. Maybe you were involved in something scandalous with a married man. Maybe your family has financial troubles. The possibilities were endless, and gossip filled in the gaps with the most dramatic options available. But here is the complicated part. Women were only allowed to cut someone if they had very good reason. According to the etiquette guides of the period, and there were many, all of them contradicting each other on fine points, a lady could only cut someone who had behaved in a way that made continued acquaintance impossible, someone who had lied to her, someone who had spread malicious gossip, someone who had behaved with shocking impropriety, or, in some cases, someone whose family had experienced such a dramatic fall in fortune or reputation that continuing the acquaintance would taint your own standing. The problem was that very good reason was completely subjective. What one person considered a cutting offence, another might consider a minor social hiccup. This meant that getting cut could feel completely arbitrary. You might have no idea what you did wrong, and because the person who cut you was not going to explain, that would require acknowledging you, which defeated the entire purpose. You were left in a terrible limbo of uncertainty and shame. Let me tell you about a real historical example that shows just how serious this could get. In 1820, Caroline of Brunswick, the estranged wife of the Prince Regent, soon to be King George IV, returned to England after years on the continent. The situation was messy. George hated Caroline. He had tried to divorce her. He had accused her of adultery. He wanted her gone. And he made it very clear to everyone in society that anyone who acknowledged Caroline, anyone who received her, anyone who was seen speaking to her, would be cut by the royal family. This put the aristocracy in an impossible position. Caroline was still technically the Princess of Wales. She would soon be Queen Consort when George ascended the throne. But the king-to-be had essentially declared war on her. So what were people supposed to do? If you bowed to Caroline, you risked being cut by the most powerful people in England. If you cut Caroline, you were cutting someone who might soon be your queen. It was a social nightmare. Many people chose to cut her. They saw her in public and looked away. They passed her in their carriages and stared straight ahead. Lady Jersey, who had been one of the Prince Regent's mistresses and was a powerful figure in society, made a point of cutting Caroline at every opportunity. And each time it happened, it was reported in the newspapers. The scandal sheets ate it up. The princess was cut by Lady So-and-so at Vauxhall Gardens. Lady such-and-such turned her back when Her Royal Highness entered the room. It became a spectator sport, but some brave souls refused to cut her. Lady Anne Hamilton, who had been one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting, continued to acknowledge her in public. She bowed, she spoke to her, she visited her. And for this loyalty, Lady Anne found herself increasingly isolated from the highest levels of society. Invitations dried up, people began cutting her. The punishment spread like ripples in a pond. If you were friends with someone who was being cut, you might be cut yourself. Guilt by association. Now let us talk about what happened if you accidentally cut someone. Because this happened. Oh, did this happen? Imagine you are walking down the street. lost in thought. Maybe you are worried about your sister's health. Maybe you're mentally going through the menu for the dinner party you are hosting next week. Maybe you just have a headache and you're not paying close attention. Someone you know walks past and greets you, and you do not respond. Because you were not paying attention. You did not see them, you did not hear them. It was completely innocent. But they do not know that. All they know is that you looked right at them and did not respond. They have been cut and they are going to tell people. Can you believe it? Mrs. Williams cut me on the street today, right outside the lending library. I greeted her cheerfully and she looked through me as if I were nobody. And now you have a problem, a big problem. This is why the etiquette guides were very serious about paying attention when you were in public. You had to be constantly scanning for familiar faces. You had to be ready to nod, smile, and acknowledge at a moment's notice. Because an accidental cut could be just as damaging as an intentional one, and proving it was an accident. That required you to send an apologetic note, or to visit the person, or to have a mutual friend explain. It was exhausting. There is a wonderful passage in a letter from the era, I am paraphrasing, but the sentiment is clear, where a woman writes to her sister, I am quite worn out from the effort of walking through town. One must keep one's eyes constantly moving, one's face arranged in pleasant readiness, prepared at any moment to adjust one's expression to match the rank and intimacy of whoever one might encounter. By the time I reached home, my face actually ached from smiling. Can you imagine your face hurting from the social effort of walking down the street? Now let us compare this to something we deal with today. Have you ever ghosted someone or been ghosted? For those of you lucky enough not to know the term, ghosting is when someone you've been talking to, maybe even dating, suddenly stops responding to your messages. They just disappear. No explanation, no closure, just silence. And it feels terrible, right? You're left wondering what you did wrong, whether you misread the situation, whether they are okay or just avoiding you. Cutting in the Regency era was like ghosting but weaponized. It happened in person, in public, with witnesses. There was no ambiguity. Everyone knew you were being deliberately ignored, and the social consequences were catastrophic. Getting ghosted today might hurt your feelings and make you lose faith in humanity for a while. Getting cut in 1815 could mean your marriage prospects evaporated, your friends abandoned you, and your family's reputation suffered. It was social death, performed in broad daylight. But here is what makes this whole system even more twisted. The rules were different depending on where the cut happened. If someone cut you at a private party in someone's home, that was considered less severe than being cut in a public place like the street or the theatre. Why? Because fewer people witnessed it. The humiliation was contained. But if someone cut you at a crowded assembly, or in the pump room at Bath where everyone gathered to see and be seen, that was maximum damage. That was a statement. That was war. And the timing mattered too. If you cut someone early in the social season, that magical period from roughly January to August when the aristocracy descended on London for parliament parties and matchmaking, you were essentially writing them off for the entire season. They would know that you were not going to acknowledge them at any of the balls, routs or dinners to come. They might as well pack up and go back to the country because their season was over. There were also degrees of cutting. A complete cut meant no acknowledgement at all. Eyes forward, face blank, moving right past someone as if they were furniture. But there was also the partial cut, which was somehow even more cruel. This was when you acknowledged someone's presence, maybe the tiniest nod, maybe a flicker of eye contact, but refused to engage in conversation. You'd confirmed that yes, you saw them, and no, you were not going to speak to them. It left no room for doubt. This was not an accident. This was a choice. Jane Austen, who understood the social dynamics of her era better than almost anyone, includes cutting in her novels, though sometimes it is so subtle you might miss it. In Persuasion, there is a moment when Anne Elliot encounters Captain Wentworth, the man she was once engaged to but was persuaded to give up after years of separation. They are at a concert. Their eyes meet, and Wentworth bows, barely, just enough to acknowledge her presence, but without any warmth, any invitation to conversation. It is not quite a cut, but it is close. It is the social equivalent of, I see you, I acknowledge you, but I want nothing to do with you. And Anne feels every bit of that coldness, but Austen also shows us the power women had through cutting. In Pride and Prejudice, after Mr. Darcy's first proposal goes horribly wrong, Elizabeth Bennet essentially cuts him for weeks. She avoids him. When she cannot avoid him, she is coldly polite. She makes it clear that his presence is not welcome. And for a man like Darcy, who is used to being sought after, courted, flattered because of his wealth and status, Elizabeth's rejection cuts deeper than any physical wound. She has the power to hurt him because she has the power to withhold her acknowledgement, her regard, her presence. Now, I mentioned earlier that men could not cut people, but that did not mean they were powerless. Men had a different recourse when they felt their honour had been insulted or their reputation damaged. They could challenge someone to a duel, and duels, while officially illegal, happened with shocking regularity during the Regency period. A gentleman could not cut you, but he could absolutely challenge you to meet him at dawn with pistols, which, when you think about it, makes cutting seem rather civilized by comparison. At least nobody died from being ignored. Usually, the fear of being cut shaped behavior in profound ways. People were careful, so careful about what they said and did, because you never knew who might decide you had crossed a line. You never knew when someone might take offence at something you thought was innocent. The threat of cutting hung over every social interaction like a sword, and it made people cautious, anxious, and hyper-aware of how they were being perceived. But there was also something darkly fascinating about the power of cutting. It gave women, who had very little formal power in Regency society, a weapon they could wield. A woman could not vote. She could not own property if she was married. She could not pursue most professions, but she could destroy someone's social standing with a single well-timed cut. That is not nothing. That is power of a very particular kind. And sometimes women use that power beautifully. There are accounts of women cutting men who had behaved badly toward other women, men who had seduced and abandoned young women, men who had spread rumours, men who had used their positions of power to take advantage of those below them. These women could not take these men to court. They could not publicly denounce them without risking their own reputations, but they could cut them. And when enough important women cut someone, that person became a social pariah. It was a form of justice, however imperfect. Of course, it could also be wielded cruelly. People could be cut for ridiculous reasons, for wearing the wrong dress, for having an accent that marked them as provincial, for being too clever or too quiet or too anything that did not fit the narrow definition of acceptable. The same power that could be used for justice could be used for petty tyranny. And it often was. I want you to imagine carrying that weight every time you left your house, every time you attended a social event. The constant awareness that one misstep, one accidental offence, one moment of being yourself a little too loudly could result in being cut, could result in becoming invisible to the people who mattered. Is it any wonder that people in this era were described as being so obsessed with propriety, so careful in their speech and manners? The consequences of stepping out of line were very, very real. So the next time you see someone you know in public and you cheerfully wave and call out their name, take a moment to appreciate that freedom. You're not risking anything. There are no social consequences. You're just being friendly. But for someone in 1815, that simple warm acknowledgement was a gift. It said, "I see you, I recognize you, you matter." And the withholding of that acknowledgement, that was a weapon sharper than any sword. But we are not done exploring the social minefield of Regency England, because even if you successfully navigated introductions and managed not to get cut, there was still the matter of actually moving through public spaces without causing a scandal. And this is where things get truly absurd, because apparently standing still while talking to someone was practically a criminal offence. Up next, we are diving into one of the strangest rules of all. Why conversation had to happen while walking, why stopping to chat on the street could ruin your reputation, and the bizarre choreography of sidewalk etiquette that turned a simple stroll into a high-stakes performance. Trust me, after this, you will never take a casual walk for granted again. Here is something that will blow your mind. In Regency England, if you wanted to have a conversation with someone on the street, you could not just stop and talk. You had to keep moving. Like some sort of polite, well-dressed sharks who would die if they stopped swimming, ladies and gentlemen of the era had to conduct their street conversations while walking. And if you think that sounds exhausting and ridiculous, well, you're absolutely right. But the reasons behind this bizarre rule reveal something fascinating about how public space, reputation and social control all tangle together in ways that would make your head spin. Let me set the scene for you. It is a beautiful spring morning in 1816. You're strolling down Bond Street in London, one of the most fashionable shopping streets in the city. The sun is shining. The shop windows are full of gorgeous merchandise, gloves in every colour imaginable, bonnets trimmed with flowers and ribbons, books fresh from the printers, jewellery that catches the light. Other well-dressed people are promenading up and down, seeing and being seen. This is where you come not just to shop, but to be part of society, to notice who is wearing what, who is walking with whom, who has just arrived in town for the season, and then you see her. Lady Pemberton, a woman you met at a musical evening last week. You had a delightful conversation about the latest novels. She promised to lend you her copy of a new book everyone is talking about. You genuinely like her, and she has spotted you too. She is smiling. You are smiling. This is going to be pleasant. You start to slow down, preparing to stop and exchange greetings properly. And then Lady Pemberton does something that seems very strange. She keeps walking. Not past you, toward you. And when she reaches you, she falls into step beside you, still moving, and begins the conversation without ever coming to a halt. If you were new to society, you might find this odd. But Lady Pemberton is doing exactly what she is supposed to do. Because according to the social rules of Regency England, stopping to talk on a busy street was improper. It was considered low class. It was something servants or tradespeople might do, but never a lady or gentleman of quality. The proper thing to do was to continue walking while conversing. You matched your pace to your companions, you walked together for a suitable distance, and then you parted ways with a polite farewell, all while in motion. Now, why? Why on earth would standing still be considered rude? The etiquette manuals of the time give us a few reasons, and they are wonderfully revealing about the anxieties and priorities of this era. First, standing still on a crowded street was considered inconsiderate because you were blocking traffic. And streets in Regency London were crowded, not just with pedestrians, but with horses, carriages, sedan chairs, street vendors, delivery boys, all kinds of activity. If you and your friends stopped right in the middle of the pavement to chat, you were creating an obstacle. People would have to walk around you. They might even brush against you as they passed. Physical contact with strangers? Absolutely unacceptable. You were forcing other people into impropriety by being an impediment. But that was the practical reason. The real reason, the deeper reason, was about something else entirely. Standing still while talking, especially if you were a woman, made you visible in a way that was considered dangerous. It drew attention. It made you a spectacle. And ladies, especially unmarried ladies, were supposed to move through public spaces as discreetly as possible. You were supposed to be seen, yes, but not stared at, not examined, not made into an object of prolonged scrutiny. Standing still for an extended conversation meant that every person who walked past you had time to look at you, to study you, to form opinions about you. And that was far too much visibility for comfort. Think about it this way. When you are walking, you are a moving target. People get a glimpse of you as you pass. Maybe they notice your dress or your companion, but then you're gone. The interaction is fleeting. But when you stand still, you become a fixed point. People can watch you. They can eavesdrop on your conversation. They can notice every detail of your appearance and behavior. And in a society obsessed with reputation, where a single misstep could ruin you, that kind of extended visibility was risky. The Habits of Good Society, a popular etiquette manual from the mid-1800s, yes, slightly after our Regency period, but the rules carried over, explicitly states that street conversations must be brief and conducted while walking. It warns that to stand talking in the streets is not the mark of a lady or gentleman. Standing still was associated with gossips, with people who had nothing better to do, with those who lacked the refinement to understand proper public behaviour. It was a class marker, and in a society as rigidly stratified as Regency England, class markers mattered enormously. But here is where it gets even more interesting. The rule about walking while talking was not absolute. It depended on context. If you were in a garden, say one of London's beautiful pleasure gardens like Vauxhall or Ranelagh, you could stop to admire the flowers or a particularly lovely view while chatting with a companion. Gardens were designed for leisurely strolling and pausing. They were controlled, private-ish spaces where the usual street rules relaxed a bit. But on a public street, keep moving, and the type of conversation mattered too. If you encountered someone and the conversation was going to be truly brief, a quick greeting, an exchange of pleasantries, maybe an inquiry about mutual friends, you could manage that while barely slowing down. You would nod, smile, say a few words and continue on your way. The whole interaction might take 10 seconds, but if the conversation was going to extend beyond those quick pleasantries, if you had actual news to share, plans to discuss, gossip to exchange, then you absolutely had to start walking together. To stand there talking for several minutes? Scandalous. Now let me tell you about an even more complicated piece of this puzzle, the concept of giving the wall. This was a crucial part of sidewalk etiquette, and it shows just how choreographed every moment of public movement actually was. When two people were walking together on a pavement, one person walked on the outside closer to the street and one person walked on the inside closer to the buildings. The inside position was considered safer and more prestigious. Why? Because the street was full of hazards. Carriages and horses created mud, splashed dirty water, and occasionally lost control. Street vendors might jostle you. Chamber pots might be emptied from windows above. Yes, really. Though this was becoming less common by the Regency period, thank goodness. The inside position, next to the wall, protected you from all of that. So a gentleman always gave the wall to a lady. He walked on the outside, putting himself between her and potential danger. It was a gesture of protection and respect. But what happened when the hierarchy got complicated? If two gentlemen were walking together, the person of higher social rank got the wall. If two ladies were walking together, same rule, the higher ranking lady got the preferred position. And if you were walking with someone and you encountered a person of even higher rank coming from the opposite direction, you might need to switch positions mid-walk to ensure the most important person had the wall. It was like a constant subtle dance of social positioning, happening on every street in every fashionable neighbourhood. There is a wonderful description in Evelina, a novel by Frances Burney, published in 1778 but still widely read during the Regency, where the naive young protagonist is constantly getting the sidewalk etiquette wrong. She does not know about giving the wall. She does not understand when to keep walking versus when to pause. She stops to talk to acquaintances on the street and her more sophisticated companions are mortified. The novel uses these mistakes to show that Evelina is new to polite society, that she has not yet learned the invisible rules that everyone else takes for granted. And readers at the time would have recognized every single one of those mistakes and probably cringed in sympathetic embarrassment. Can you imagine living like this? Every time you stepped outside, you had to be aware not just of where you were going, but of exactly how you were moving, who you were moving with, where you were positioned relative to them, and how long you were staying in any one place. Your body language, your pace, your positioning, all of it was being read and judged by everyone around you. A walk down the street was not a casual activity, it was a performance. And heaven help you if you got any of it wrong. If you stood talking too long, people would whisper that you lacked breeding. If you took the wall when you should have given it up, you would be seen as presumptuous or ignorant. If you walked too slowly, you might be accused of parading yourself for attention. If you walked too quickly, you might seem overeager or unladylike. There was a correct pace for everything, and you were expected to know it instinctively. The etiquette guides tried to help, but they often contradicted each other or gave advice so vague it was almost useless. One guide might say that a lady should walk with moderate speed, neither dawdling nor rushing. Helpful, right? Another might specify that 15-minute walks were acceptable for social purposes, but longer walks should be reserved for actual exercise in appropriate locations like parks. Yet another might warn that looking around too much while walking made you seem frivolous, but looking straight ahead without acknowledging acquaintances was rude. You could not win. And then there were the complications that arose when different rules collided. Imagine you are walking with a friend, having a perfectly proper mobile conversation, when you encounter another friend who wants to join in. Now you have 3 people. Do you all keep walking together? That might be difficult on a narrow pavement. You might have to walk in a line, which makes conversation awkward. Do you stop briefly to sort out who is going where? But stopping is not proper. Do you quickly say goodbye to one friend so you can continue walking with the other? But cutting short a conversation might seem rude. There was no perfect solution. You just had to navigate it as gracefully as possible and hope you did not commit any egregious breaches of etiquette in the process. Let me share with you one of my favourite real examples of how this played out. In Jane Austen's Persuasion, there is a scene where Anne Elliot is walking through Bath with Lady Russell, her godmother and mentor. They encounter Admiral Croft, a kind, friendly man who knows Anne well. The Admiral naturally wants to greet them and have a bit of conversation, so what happens? He turns around and walks with them. Not because he was going in that direction, he explicitly says he was heading somewhere else. But he turns around and walks with them so they can talk properly. And this is presented as perfectly normal, perfectly polite behaviour. After they have walked together for a few minutes and exhausted the immediate topics of conversation, the Admiral makes his excuses and turns back to continue his original errand. Nobody finds this strange. Nobody comments on it. It is just what you did. If you wanted to talk to someone for more than a few seconds, you matched their direction and walked with them, even if it meant going out of your way. Convenience was less important than propriety. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds exhausting, yes, but was it really that strictly enforced? Could people not just bend the rules a little? And the answer is some people did. There were always rule benders and rule breakers, but they paid a price. If you were wealthy enough, powerful enough, or eccentric enough, you might get away with standing still to talk on the street. People might whisper about your odd behaviour, but they might also write it off as an acceptable quirk of someone important. But if you were young, female, and trying to establish or maintain your reputation, you followed the rules because you could not afford not to. The anxiety this created was real and pervasive. Women in their letters and diaries from this period often mention the stress of navigating social interactions in public spaces. One woman wrote to her sister describing the exhaustion of being always on display, always arranging one's face and steps to suit the expectations of society. Another described the relief of being back in the country where she could walk and stop as I please without fear of censure. These were not trivial concerns. The mental and emotional labour of constantly performing propriety was genuine. And here is something that makes me both laugh and feel a little bit sad. All of this elaborate choreography, all of these careful rules about walking and talking and positioning, they were supposed to make social interactions smoother and more pleasant. The whole point was to create a system where everyone knew what to expect, where interactions were predictable and comfortable. But instead, they created a system where every public outing was fraught with anxiety, where a simple walk could become a minefield of potential mistakes, where the effort of following the rules was so intense that it defeated the entire purpose. Compare this to how we move through public spaces today. You can stop wherever you want to talk to someone. You can stand on the sidewalk for as long as you like, well, within reason, and as long as you are not blocking traffic. You can take out your phone and stare at it while standing completely still, and nobody will question your character or breeding. You have a freedom of the movement that would have been unthinkable in 1815. And yes, maybe we have lost something in terms of social grace and consideration. Maybe we are sometimes inconsiderate of others when we stop abruptly or block the sidewalk while texting. But we have gained so much more in terms of freedom and ease. The next time you have a conversation with someone on the street, I want you to notice whether you stop or keep walking. Chances are you do whatever feels natural in the moment. You might lean against a building. You might sit on a bench. You might stand right in the middle of the sidewalk without a second thought. And that casual, unconsidered freedom, that is something the people of Regency England would have envied. Because for them, there was nothing casual about being in public. Every moment was calculated. Every gesture had meaning. Every step was a statement. But as complicated as the rules about public walking were, they pale in comparison to what awaited you in private spaces. Because once you left the street and entered someone's home, or worse, found yourself alone with someone of the opposite sex, you entered an entirely different realm of social control. A realm where your every move was monitored, where privacy was virtually impossible, and where the presence of a third person was not just preferred, but absolutely required. That is right. We are about to talk about chaperones, the human security systems of the Regency era, the ever-present guardians of reputation, the people whose job it was to make sure nothing interesting ever happened. Get ready for the chronicles of never being alone, never having peace, and the absolutely wild lengths people went to in order to preserve propriety, or occasionally to circumvent it. There is a special kind of hell that involves being constantly watched by someone whose entire job is to make sure you do not have any fun. And if you are an unmarried woman in Regency England under the age of 30, welcome to your life, because the chaperone system was not just a quaint historical detail. It was a sophisticated surveillance apparatus designed to ensure that young women and men could not be alone together for even a moment. And the creativity people employed to work around this system, absolutely legendary. Let us start with the fundamental rule, the iron law that governed the lives of unmarried women. You could not be alone with a man. ever. Not for 5 minutes, not for 30 seconds, not even if that man was your brother's best friend whom you had known since childhood. Not even if you were discussing something completely innocent like the weather or the price of wheat. If you were female, unmarried and under 30, and you found yourself alone in a room with an unrelated male, you were in a scandal waiting to happen, even if nothing whatsoever occurred between you. Even if you sat on opposite sides of the room reading separate books in complete silence. The mere fact of being alone together was enough to ruin your reputation. Now, I want you to really think about what this means for a moment. Imagine being a 23-year-old woman who cannot have a private conversation with any man except your father and your brothers. You cannot discuss books, politics, philosophy, art, music, or anything else one-on-one with half of the human population. Every interaction must be observed. Every word must be spoken in the presence of witnesses. The opportunity for genuine intellectual connection, for deep conversation, for actually getting to know someone beyond surface pleasantries, it was nearly impossible. Unless you were very, very clever about it, the chaperone could be almost anyone deemed appropriate. Your mother was the ideal choice, of course, but she could not be with you every moment of every day, so the responsibility might fall to an older sister, an aunt, a grandmother, a family friend, a married cousin, or even a trusted servant. The key qualifications were that the chaperone had to be older than you, married or respectably past marriageable age, and trusted by your family to take the job seriously. And that job, hovering, constant, tireless, unrelenting hovering. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like in practice. You're at a ball. A young gentleman has asked you to dance. You have accepted, with your mother's approving nod, of course. You and this gentleman dance 2 dances together, which is the maximum allowed, without suggesting an understanding exists between you. The dancing is wonderful. He is charming. You are charming. The conversation flows easily despite the constraints of the dance figures, and at the end of the second dance he asks if he might fetch you some lemonade. You accept. Sounds lovely, right? A moment to catch your breath, cool down and continue the pleasant conversation. But here is what actually happens. He goes to fetch the lemonade while you return to your chaperone's side. You cannot wander off alone. You cannot even stand by yourself at the edge of the ballroom. You return to your designated guardian like a ship to harbour. The gentleman returns with 2 glasses of lemonade. He hands one to you, and then he stands there making conversation with both you and your chaperone, your mother or your aunt, or your older married sister. The 3 of you chat pleasantly about the music, the decorations, the other attendees, and that is it. That is your romantic interaction, supervised lemonade. Now, if this gentleman is genuinely interested in pursuing a courtship, he knows the rules. The next step is to call on you at your home, but even this seemingly simple act is loaded with protocol. He cannot simply show up whenever he feels like it. There were designated calling hours, typically between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, sometimes called morning calls despite occurring in what we would consider the afternoon, because the fashionable world of the Regency defined morning as anything before dinner, which was served around 7 or 8 in the evening. So he arrives during these socially acceptable hours. He is shown into the drawing room by a servant. And who is sitting there with you? Your chaperone, obviously. The visit must be brief. 15 to 20 minutes is appropriate. Any longer and people start to wonder what on earth you're finding to talk about for so long. He sits at a proper distance from you. No side-by-side sitting on the same sofa unless you're engaged, and even then it is questionable. Your chaperone sits in the room, supposedly occupied with needlework or reading, but actually monitoring every word of your conversation. And the gentleman knows this. You know this. The chaperone knows that you know. It is a bizarre theatre where everyone pretends to ignore the reality that nothing private can be said. But here is where it gets really interesting. The quality of your chaperone mattered enormously. Some chaperones were vigilant to the point of tyranny. These women took their jobs seriously. They listened to every word, they watched every gesture. They could tell if you and a young man were sitting too close together, if your eye contact was lasting too long, if your laughter was becoming too familiar. These chaperones were the reason you could not have a meaningful conversation with anyone. They were like the airport security of social interaction, thorough, humorless, and determined to prevent anything interesting from happening. But then there were the other kind of chaperones, the distracted ones, the ones who brought their knitting and got so absorbed in it that they stopped paying attention, the ones who fell asleep in their chairs at evening parties, the ones who had a poor hearing or poor eyesight and could be strategically positioned in ways that maximize their official presence while minimizing their actual effectiveness. These chaperones were gold. If you were lucky enough to have one of these as your guardian, you could sometimes achieve something almost approaching a genuine private conversation. Almost. Jane Austen, bless her observant soul, gives us perfect examples of both types. In Sense and Sensibility, Mrs. Jennings serves as a chaperone to the Dashwood sisters in London. And while Mrs. Jennings is kind and well-meaning, she is also gossipy, easily distracted, and frequently leaves the girls to their own devices more than a strict chaperone should. This creates opportunities for both good and bad things to happen. Marianne can carry on her ill-advised attachment to Willoughby with less supervision than would be ideal. Eleanor can have meaningful conversations with Colonel Brandon and Edward Ferrars without someone breathing down her neck at every moment. Contrast this with Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice, who, when she suspects that her nephew Mr. Darcy might be interested in Elizabeth Bennet, essentially appoints herself as an unofficial anti-chaperone. She descends on the Bennet home specifically to prevent a relationship from forming. She interrogates Elizabeth about whether an engagement exists. She demands promises that Elizabeth will never accept Mr. Darcy should he propose. Lady Catherine is the chaperone system on steroids, not just supervising interactions, but actively working to control them. Now let us talk about what happened if you violated the chaperone rules. If you were caught alone with a man, the consequences depended on several factors: who you were, who he was, who caught you, and what explanation could be given. If you were from a powerful, wealthy family, and the man was someone appropriate, you might escape with nothing more than a severe scolding and tighter supervision going forward. Your family could probably contain the scandal through careful social maneuvering and maybe some strategic gossip control. But if you were from a less prominent family, or if the man was considered unsuitable, or if the circumstances were particularly compromising, you could face genuine disaster. Your reputation could be ruined. Marriage proposals from respectable men would evaporate. Your sister's prospects could be damaged by association. Why would a man want to marry into a family that did not properly supervise its daughters? In extreme cases, you might be sent away to live with relatives in the country, essentially exiled from society until the scandal died down. And it might never die down completely. There are accounts of women who made one mistake at 18 and were still being whispered about at 30. There was actually a legal and social concept during this period called breach of promise. If a man spent significant unchaperoned time with a woman, especially if they were seen together repeatedly, it could be argued that he had compromised her reputation to the point where he owed her an offer of marriage. And if he failed to make that offer, the woman's family could potentially take legal action. This worked both ways, actually. Men could also sue women for breach of promise if an engagement was broken. But the key point is that unchaperoned time together had real, tangible consequences. It was not just about propriety, It was about legal and financial obligations. This is why chaperones were so important. They were not just guardians of morality. They were witnesses. They could testify that nothing improper had occurred. They could verify that the young lady had behaved correctly, that the gentleman had remained at a proper distance, that no promises were made or implied. In a society without photographs or video evidence, where reputation was everything and scandals could spread like wildfire, the chaperone was your insurance policy. But let us be honest, young people in love have always found ways around surveillance. And the Regency era was no exception. The creativity employed to snatch moments of privacy is genuinely impressive. Here are some of the tactics that show up in historical records, letters, and novels of the period. The garden walk was a classic. If you were visiting someone's estate, you might suggest a walk in the gardens. Your chaperone would come along, of course, but gardens are large. They have paths that wind and separate. You and your intended might walk ahead while discussing the roses, while the chaperone falls slightly behind. Not too far behind, that would be scandalous, but maybe 20 feet, 30, just enough distance that your voices would not carry clearly. You could finally have something approaching a real conversation. Of course, the chaperone knew exactly what you were doing, but if she was a reasonable person who remembered being young herself, she might pretend not to notice, as long as you stayed visible, as long as you did not actually disappear behind the shrubbery. There were also the accidental encounters. You mention casually to your chaperone that you want to visit the lending library at 11 o'clock. Purely coincidentally, a certain gentleman happens to be at the lending library at the same time. What are the odds? You encounter each other browsing the shelves. Some conversation naturally occurs. Your chaperone is right there, of course, sitting by the window with a book. But libraries are quiet spaces where people naturally speak in hushed tones. And if you and the gentleman happen to wander to the far end of the history section where the chaperone's view is partially blocked by tall shelves, well, you are still technically in the same room, are you not? Letters were another avenue, though they came with their own set of rules and risks. An unmarried woman could not carry on a correspondence with an unmarried man unless they were engaged, or a formal understanding existed between their families. Even then, the letters might be read by parents or guardians. Privacy in written communication was not a given. But some families were more relaxed about this than others, and if you had a sympathetic friend or servant willing to serve as a go-between, you might be able to exchange letters without your family's knowledge. This was risky, though. If the letters were discovered, the scandal would be enormous. People could assume the worst. Love letters were evidence of attachment. They could be used to pressure a man into proposing or to force a woman into accepting. They were powerful, dangerous documents. There is a fascinating real-life example from the 1790s that illustrates just how serious this was. The poet Lord Byron's mother, Catherine Gordon, had fallen in love with Captain John Byron, yes, Byron's father known as Mad Jack Byron, and they had conducted a courtship that was considered shockingly fast and improperly supervised. They married quickly, and the marriage was a disaster. Captain Byron was a fortune hunter who spent all of Catherine's money and then abandoned her. For the rest of her life, Catherine was held up as an example of what happens when women are not properly chaperoned. Her son, the famous poet, grew up hearing about how his mother's lack of proper supervision led to her terrible marriage. It became a cautionary tale told to young women across England. This is why you need a chaperone. This is why the rules exist. Now, here is a question I find really interesting. When did the chaperone rule relax? Because it did eventually. By the end of the Regency period, you start seeing hints of change. Jane Austen's later novels show more freedom for female characters. In Persuasion, published in 1818, Anne Elliot walks through Bath with only female friends for company. She goes on outings without an older guardian hovering over her every moment. This would have been much less acceptable in 1800. By the 1820s and 1830s, attitudes were shifting. Women could go out in groups without a matron present. They could attend certain public events, concerts, lectures, exhibitions without individual supervision, as long as they went in respectable company. Why the change? Partly it was practical. As the middle class expanded, there were simply more women who needed to move through public spaces for work, shopping, family obligations. The strict rules of the aristocracy did not translate well to the busy lives of doctors' daughters, attorneys' wives, merchants' sisters. These women could not afford to have a dedicated chaperone trailing them everywhere. They had things to do. Society had to adapt. But the change was also philosophical. The Enlightenment ideas that had been percolating through European society since the 1700s emphasized reason, individual rights, and personal responsibility. Some progressive thinkers began arguing that women should be trusted to govern their own behavior, that constant surveillance was insulting and counterproductive. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, argued that women should be educated and trusted as rational beings, not treated as children who needed constant monitoring. These ideas were radical at the time, and they took decades to gain any real traction, but they were out there, slowly shifting the conversation. Of course, the chaperone system never completely disappeared. Even in the early 1900s, proper young ladies were still expected to have some form of supervision when courting. The rules were more relaxed than they had been a century earlier, but they still existed. It really was not until after World War I, when so many social conventions were blown apart by the trauma and upheaval of the war, that the chaperone system finally collapsed. By the 1920s, young women could go out alone with men. They could attend dances without older guardians. They could have actual privacy. The change that had started so slowly in the Regency period finally reached its conclusion. But back in 1815, if you were an unmarried woman trying to get to know a man you liked, you had to work within the system. You had to accept that privacy was a luxury you could not afford. Every conversation would have an audience. Every interaction would be monitored. And you had to be okay with that. Or at least you had to pretend to be okay with it while secretly being very, very frustrated. I think about the emotional toll this must have taken. The constant performance, the inability to ever let your guard down, the knowledge that someone was always watching, always judging, always ready to report back to your parents if you stepped out of line even slightly. It must have been exhausting and lonely in a strange way. You could be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone because you could never have a truly private, genuine moment with anyone outside your immediate family. And yet people managed. They fell in love despite the obstacles. They formed real connections even within the rigid constraints. They found ways to communicate genuine feeling through carefully chosen words, meaningful glances, the subtle language of flowers and music and poetry. The chaperone system did not prevent romance. It just made it incredibly complicated and frustrating, which, honestly, might have made it more intense. There is something about forbidden or difficult love that makes it burn brighter. When you can only snatch a few moments of semi-private conversation, those moments become precious. Every word matters. Every glance carries weight. So the next time you casually meet up with someone you are interested in, just the two of you, no supervision required, take a moment to appreciate that freedom. You can say whatever you want. You can talk for hours. You can go wherever you want. Nobody is watching, nobody is judging, nobody is reporting back to your parents. That kind of privacy, that kind of freedom is a gift that people in the Regency era would have given almost anything to have. But speaking of things that were tightly controlled and heavily monitored, we need to talk about dinner parties. Because if you thought navigating introductions and chaperones was complicated, wait until you see the elaborate protocol surrounding a simple meal. The seating arrangements alone could cause diplomatic incidents. The rules about what to eat, how much to drink, and when to leave the table were so specific and so bizarre that entire guidebooks were dedicated to helping people avoid embarrassment. Coming up next, we are diving into the minefield of Regency dining etiquette, where refusing the soup could ruin your reputation and asking for wine was practically a scandal. Trust me, after this you will never complain about modern dinner party awkwardness again. You have been invited to dinner. Congratulations. Now prepare yourself for one of the most stressful experiences of your social life. Because a Regency dinner party was not just a meal, it was a test, a performance, a 3-hour examination of your breeding, your manners, your understanding of the thousands of unwritten rules that governed every moment from the moment you walked through the door until the blessed relief of finally being allowed to leave. And heaven help you if you got any of it wrong, because the entire room would notice, remember, and gossip about it for weeks. Let me walk you through what actually happened at one of these events, step by excruciating step. First, the invitation. You receive a card delivered by a servant, inviting you to dine at the home of Mr. and Mrs. whoever on such and such a date at such and such a time. The time is important. In London and other fashionable areas, dinner had moved later and later during the Regency period. By 1815, dinner might be served anywhere from 7 to 9 in the evening. In the country, people still dined earlier, perhaps 5 or 6, but city dwellers prided themselves on their fashionable late dining. Why? Because it showed you did not need to work. You could afford to organise your day around pleasure rather than necessity. Even your meal times were status symbols. You must respond to the invitation in writing, and you must do so promptly. To Trussler's etiquette guide is very clear about this. Accepting a dinner invitation requires written acknowledgement as soon as possible. And when the day arrives, you must arrive on time, not early. Showing up early suggested you were overeager, possibly even hungry, which was mortifying, but certainly not late. Trussler recommends arriving at least 15 minutes before the appointed dinner hour. This gave you time to be received, to greet your hosts properly, to exchange pleasantries with other guests, and to position yourself appropriately for the procession to the dining room. Ah, yes, the procession. Because you did not just wander into the dining room whenever you felt like it. Oh no, there was an order to everything. When dinner was announced, usually by a servant appearing at the drawing room door to inform the hostess that dinner was served, the guests would form up in a specific arrangement. The host would lead the way, escorting the highest-ranking female guest. Then came the other guests, paired up according to the rank and precedent, with the hostess bringing up the rear with the highest-ranking male guest. It was like a wedding procession, except it happened before every single meal. And where you sat, that was determined entirely by your social status. The hostess sat at one end of the table, usually the end considered the top. The host might sit at the opposite end, or sometimes in the middle of one side. The guest of honour, the person of highest rank, would sit to the right of the hostess. From there, guests were arranged in descending order of importance, alternating male and female when possible. One of the curious rules was that husbands and wives should not sit next to each other. The thinking was that married couples saw each other all the time at home. At a dinner party, they should engage with other people. Also, sitting married couples together might lead to private conversations that excluded others, which was considered rude. Can you imagine the complexity of arranging all this? If you were hosting a dinner party for 12 people, you had to know the exact social standing of every single person. You had to understand the minute gradations of the aristocracy. A viscount outranked a baron. But what about a baronet versus the younger son of an earl? What about a wealthy merchant versus a poor gentleman? What about a military officer versus a clergyman? The hostess had to make these calculations and seat everyone in a way that would not insult anyone or create awkward social situations. One seating mistake could cause genuine offence and damage relationships. Now, let us talk about the food. A proper Regency dinner was served in courses, but not the way we understand courses today. Instead of everyone being served one dish at a time, appetizer, then main course, then dessert, the Regency style was to bring out multiple dishes at once. This was called service à la française, the French style. In the first course, the table would be laid with anywhere from 6 to 20 dishes depending on the size of the party. There would be soups at either end of the table, fish dishes, meat dishes, vegetable dishes, all arranged symmetrically. Here is where it gets interesting. You did not eat all of the dishes. You ate what was within reach. The gentleman sitting next to you had a responsibility to serve you from the dishes near him, but he was not supposed to fill your plate completely. That would suggest you were gluttonous. Instead, he would offer you a modest portion. You were expected to eat a little bit of everything placed before you, but not too much of any one thing. Eating with obvious enthusiasm was vulgar. You were supposed to appear delicate, refined, eating because social convention required it, not because you were actually hungry. And the soup. Oh, the soup. According to multiple etiquette manuals, including The Mirror of Graces, published in 1811, a lady must never refuse the soup. Even if you hated soup, even if you were not hungry, even if the sight of soup made you feel ill, you accepted the soup. You ate at least a few spoonfuls, because refusing the soup was tantamount to insulting your hostess. It suggested that you found her hospitality inadequate. It was a breach of etiquette serious enough to be remarked upon. Can you imagine? Did you hear about Miss Thompson? She refused the soup at the Harrisons' dinner. Can you believe it? What shocking manners! After the first course was consumed, or at least politely picked at, the table would be cleared by servants, every dish removed, every plate taken away, and then the second course would be brought out. More dishes, different meats, perhaps game birds or venison, more vegetables, perhaps some pastries or tarts, and again you ate what was within reach, served by the gentleman next to you, accepting modest portions of several things. You were engaging in conversation the entire time, of course. Light, pleasant conversation. Nothing too serious, nothing controversial. The art was to appear engaged in the social occasion, while also managing the complex choreography of eating, drinking, and not making a mess. Speaking of drinking, wine was served throughout the meal, but here is something that will shock you. A lady could not ask for wine. She had to wait for a gentleman to offer it to her. And this is where the etiquette gets beautifully, ridiculously specific. According to the conduct books of the era, when a gentleman poured wine for a lady, she was expected to drink in moderation. What counted as moderation? Hard to say exactly, but the guides were very clear that drinking too much or too enthusiastically would lead people to say you were drinking like a man, which was absolutely not a compliment. It suggested you were coarse, unfeminine, possibly even loose in your morals. The system for requesting wine was equally bizarre. A gentleman could not simply pour wine for a lady whenever he felt like it. That would be presumptuous. Instead, there was a ritual. The gentleman would catch the lady's eye and gesture slightly toward the wine. She would nod or smile to indicate acceptance. He would pour. She would drink. The entire interaction required silent communication and perfect timing. And if you got it wrong, if you nodded too enthusiastically or drank too much or, heaven forbid, actually asked out loud for wine, people noticed. After the second course came dessert, and even this had specific rules. The tablecloth would be rolled up, yes, rolled up with all the crumbs trapped inside, and removed. This was to prevent crumbs from getting into the dessert service. Then the dessert would be laid out. Fresh fruits, preserved fruits, sweetmeats, ices, jellies, elaborate confections. This was the course where the hostess could really show off. A grand dessert display demonstrated wealth, taste, and access to exotic ingredients. Pineapples were particularly prized because they were expensive and difficult to obtain. If you could serve fresh pineapple to your guests, you were announcing to the world that you had serious money. But even the dessert course had its pitfalls. You had to know how to eat each type of fruit properly. Oranges required a specific technique. Grapes had to be handled just so. And whatever you did, you could not appear too eager, the young lady who filled her plate with sweets and ate with obvious pleasure. She would be judged. The etiquette manuals actually warned women against showing too much interest in food. It was considered unladylike. You were supposed to eat like a bird, delicate little bites, long pauses between mouthfuls. Never mind that you might be genuinely hungry after a long day. Appetite was not feminine. And then came the moment that must have been the most welcome part of any dinner party. The ladies withdrew. After dessert was finished, the hostess would make some signal. Perhaps catching the eye of the highest-ranking female guest. Perhaps simply standing, and all the ladies would rise and leave the dining room. They would return to the drawing room for tea and conversation. Meanwhile, the gentlemen remained at the table with their port and their brandy. This separation typically lasted at least half an hour, sometimes longer. The men would discuss politics, business, sport, topics considered too coarse or complex for female ears. The women would discuss, well, whatever women were permitted to discuss. Fashion, perhaps. Upcoming social events, carefully neutral topics that would not be considered too intellectual or opinionated. This separation of the sexes after dinner is fascinating from a modern perspective. Can you imagine organising your social events this way? Okay, dinner is done, women go to the living room, men stay here. We would find it absurd and insulting. But in the Regency era, it was not even questioned. It was simply how things were done. And interestingly, many women appreciated this time. It gave them a chance to talk freely without male oversight, to bond with other women, to relax slightly from the performance of perfect femininity they had to maintain during mixed company. But let us circle back to the stress of the meal itself. Imagine you are a young woman attending your first grown-up dinner party. You're 17, maybe 18. You've been instructed in proper table manners, but this is your debut in real society. The pressure is enormous. You have to remember not to refuse the soup. You have to wait for the gentleman next to you to serve you. You have to eat delicately but not appear finicky. You have to engage in pleasant conversation without monopolizing attention or appearing too clever. You have to manage your wine consumption. You have to know when to stand and withdraw with the other ladies. And you have to do all of this while looking serene, poised, and perfectly at ease. The etiquette writer John Trussler actually addresses this anxiety in his guide. He acknowledges that many young people find formal dinners intimidating. His advice? Watch the other guests and follow their lead. Do not be the first to do anything. Wait and observe. If you're unsure about a particular food or how to eat it, watch someone else first and copy them. It is practical advice, but it also reveals just how stressed people were about getting it right. There are wonderful accounts in letters and diaries from the period of dinner party disasters. One young woman writes to her sister about accidentally knocking over a wine glass, shattering it and splattering red wine across the white tablecloth. She was mortified. She writes that she wanted to sink through the floor and never be seen again. Another account describes a gentleman who, caught up in an animated story, gestured too enthusiastically and sent a dish of peas flying across the table. These were social catastrophes. People would talk about them for months. Remember when Mr. So-and-so launched the peas? Can you imagine? But the most unforgivable sin at a dinner party was leaving early without good reason. If you accepted a dinner invitation, you were committing to the entire evening. You could not simply eat and dash. After the gentlemen finished their port and rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, there would typically be more socializing, perhaps some music, perhaps cards. The evening might not end until 11 or midnight, sometimes even later, and you were expected to stay the whole time. Leaving early suggested you were bored, that you found the company inadequate, that you had somewhere better to be. It was an insult to your hosts. However, if you absolutely had to leave early, perhaps you had another commitment, perhaps you were genuinely unwell, there was a way to do it. The practice was called taking French leave. You would leave quietly without making a fuss, without interrupting the flow of the party. You would find a moment when attention was directed elsewhere, catch your host's or hostess's eye, gesture apologetically toward the door and slip out. You would send a note the next day apologizing and explaining. It was not ideal, but it was acceptable if done correctly. What you could not do was make a big production of your departure, drawing everyone's attention to the fact that you were abandoning the party. That was unforgivable. I find myself wondering about the servants during all of this, because while the guests were navigating this elaborate social dance, there were servants in the room constantly, bringing food, pouring wine, clearing dishes. They were witnessing every moment, every mistake, every awkward interaction, and they talked among themselves, of course. The servant network was its own social world with its own hierarchies and its own gossip. A clumsy guest, a rude host, an interesting conversation, all of this would be discussed in the servants' hall after the guests had gone home. The people who were supposed to be invisible were actually the best informed observers in the house. There is a fascinating detail in some of the household management books from this era. They instruct servants to be completely silent while serving, to move smoothly and unobtrusively, to essentially pretend they cannot hear what is being said around them. But everyone knew this was fiction. The servants heard everything, they saw everything, and if you were rude to them, if you treated them badly, word would spread. Other servants would hear about it, and you might find that service at future events became mysteriously slower or less attentive. The people with the least official power often had the most information and, in their own way, significant influence. Now, how does any of this connect to our modern experience? Well, most of us have been to dinners that made us anxious. Maybe a formal work dinner with important clients. Maybe dinner with your partner's parents for the first time. Maybe a holiday meal with extended family where you are trying to make a good impression. That flutter of nerves, that hyper-awareness of your behavior, that fear of making a mistake. That is a tiny taste of what every dinner party felt like in the Regency era. Except for them, it was not occasional stress. It was constant. Every social meal was a test, and failure had real consequences. But here is what I find beautiful about it. In a strange way, people adapted. They learned to navigate these absurd rules. They found ways to be genuine within the constraints. A meaningful glance across the table, a carefully chosen compliment that conveyed real warmth despite the formal language. Small acts of kindness, a gentleman noticing that a shy young lady needed help and discreetly serving her before she had to ask. These moments of real human connection happened despite all the protocol, maybe even because of it. When you have to work that hard to communicate, every small gesture carries extra weight. So the next time you sit down to dinner with friends and someone reaches across the table to grab the salt without waiting for it to be passed, or someone asks directly for more wine, or someone leaves early because they have an early morning, take a moment to appreciate the casual freedom of it all. No processions, no seating charts based on social rank, no mandatory soup consumption, no gender segregation, just people eating together, being themselves. That is a luxury that would have seemed impossible to someone in 1815, and it is something we should never take for granted. But as complicated as dinner parties were, they pale in comparison to what happened when people actually had to talk to each other. Because the rules governing forms of address, the use of names, and the proper way to speak to people of different ranks, these were so intricate and so strictly enforced that one wrong word could mark you as an outsider forever. And that is exactly where we are heading next, into the bizarre world of names, titles, and why calling someone by their first name could be considered scandalously intimate. Get ready to discover why Elizabeth Bennet calling Mr. Darcy Fitzwilliam is actually a much bigger deal than you probably realised. What is in a name? Well, in Regency England, everything. Your entire relationship with another person, the level of intimacy you shared, your relative social positions, your family connections, all of this was communicated through what you called each other, and the rules were so layered with meaning that using the wrong form of address could be more shocking than a physical touch. In fact, calling someone by their first name when you were not entitled to do so was considered almost scandalously intimate. It was a verbal trespass into private territory, and the complexity of navigating titles, surnames, and the rare privilege of given names. It was enough to make your head spin. Think about your own life for a moment. How many people do you call by their first names? Probably most people you know, right? Your friends, your co-workers, your neighbours, maybe even your boss. First names are the default in our world. We introduce ourselves with first names. Hi, I am Jennifer. Nice to meet you, I am David. It is casual, friendly, egalitarian. But in the Regency era, that kind of immediate first-name familiarity would have been jaw-droppingly inappropriate. It would have marked you as either hopelessly uneducated about social norms or shockingly forward and presumptuous. Let me give you the hierarchy of how people addressed each other, starting from the most formal and working our way down to the most intimate. At the top, you had titles. If someone had an aristocratic title, you used it. Always. Lord C. somebody, Lady somebody, Sir somebody for a baronet or knight, the Honourable Mr. somebody for the younger sons of viscounts and barons. These titles were not optional. They were requirements. Using them correctly showed that you understood the social order and respected it. Getting them wrong suggested ignorance or worse, deliberate disrespect, and the titles themselves were maddeningly complex. Take the Darcy family from Pride and Prejudice. Fitzwilliam Darcy is a gentleman, but he's not titled nobility, so he is Mr. Darcy. His aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is Lady Catherine, because she is the daughter of an earl and married a knight. Her daughter Anne is Miss de Bourgh, but Darcy's friend, the son of an earl, is the Honourable Colonel Fitzwilliam in formal situations, though he might be called Colonel Fitzwilliam in casual conversation. Are you confused yet? Because people in that era had to keep all of this straight automatically, without thinking about it, or risk massive social embarrassment. Now, for people without titles, which was most people, even the upper classes, you use surnames. Mr. Last Name for men, Miss Last Name for unmarried women, Mrs. Last Name for married women. This was the standard, the default, the safe option. If you had been properly introduced to someone, you called them by their title and surname or just their surname with the appropriate honorific. Mr. Bingley, Miss Bennet, Mrs. Gardner. This level of formality was maintained even between people who saw each other regularly, who were friendly, who genuinely liked each other. Here is what really drives this home. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet and her sister Jane see Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy constantly throughout the novel. They attend balls together, they visit each other's homes, they have long conversations. Elizabeth and Darcy eventually fall in love, and yet throughout almost the entire novel they call each other Mr. Darcy, and Miss Bennet. Even when Darcy proposes to Elizabeth the first time, when it goes badly, he still calls her Miss Bennet. Even in a moment of intense emotion, of bared hearts and hurt feelings, they maintain the formal distance of surnames. It is only after they are engaged, after a firm understanding exists between them, that Elizabeth gains the right to call him by his first name. And even then, we do not actually see it happen in the text. Jane Austen, in her brilliance, leaves that moment off the page. She lets us imagine it. Can you picture how significant that would have been? After months of Mr. Darcy and Miss Bennet, to suddenly say Fitzwilliam or to hear Elizabeth. It would have been breathtakingly intimate. It would have marked the crossing of a threshold, the creation of a new kind of relationship where the formal barriers finally came down. But let us dig deeper into when first names were actually allowed. The rules were surprisingly strict. You could use first names with your immediate family, parents, siblings, grandparents. That was automatic. You could also use them with very close childhood friends if your families were of similar social standing and you had grown up together. But even this came with caveats. Two girls who'd been best friends at 15 might find that, as they entered society and became young ladies of marriageable age, the informality had to decrease. They might go from Mary and Sarah to Miss Smith and Miss Jones, at least in public or mixed company. Privacy might allow a return to first names, but public situations required formality. Between men and women who were not related, first names were essentially forbidden unless you were engaged or married. A man could not call an unmarried woman by her first name unless he was her fiancée. Even then, he would only do so in private or in front of immediate family. In public, in society, they would still use formal address until after the wedding. And a woman certainly could not use a man's first name unless they had that same level of committed relationship. To do otherwise was to suggest an intimacy that did not exist. Or worse, an intimacy that existed but should not. It was the verbal equivalent of a physical indiscretion. There is a fascinating passage in Mansfield Park where Austen uses names to show the evolution of a relationship. Henry Crawford, trying to court Fanny Price, starts pushing boundaries. He finds ways to use her first name in conversation, just casually dropping Fanny into his sentences, and Fanny is deeply uncomfortable with it. She has not given him permission. They're not engaged. They're not even really friends by her estimation. But he is using her first name as if they have an intimacy they do not have. He is trying to create closeness through naming, and it works on some level. It does create a sense of familiarity, but it also feels like a violation, because he is taking something he has not earned. The power dynamics of naming were significant. A person of higher social rank might call someone of lower rank by their first name, but not vice versa. An employer might call a servant Mary or John, but the servant would always say sir or madam, or use the employer's title and surname. A wealthy aunt might call her poor relation by her first name, while the poor relation would say aunt's surname rather than aunt first name. This one-directional informality reinforced hierarchy. It reminded everyone where they stood in the social order. You could only be informal downward, never upward. And this extended to children. Adults of higher rank might call other people's children by their first names, but those children would use formal address for the adults. Even between families who were close friends, children would call each other's parents Mr. and Mrs. surname rather than by first names. The idea of children calling adults by their first names, which is common in some modern households, would have been unthinkable. It would have been seen as promoting disrespect and breaking down proper social order. Now let us talk about siblings, because even here there were interesting nuances. Within the family you generally used first names with your brothers and sisters. That was the norm. but in public or in mixed company there were modifications. The eldest daughter was referred to as Miss Surname with no first name attached. Younger daughters were Miss First Name Surname. So in the Bennet family, Jane is Miss Bennet. Elizabeth, being the second daughter, is Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Mary is Miss Mary Bennet, and so on. This immediately communicated birth order and by extension marriage prospects, since the eldest daughter typically married first. Brothers were a bit simpler. The eldest son who would inherit the title and estate was Mr. Surname. Younger sons were Mr. First Name Surname. This is why Bingley, who is an eldest son, is simply Mr. Bingley. But Darcy's cousin, a younger son of an earl, is Colonel Fitzwilliam. Both his military rank and his first name are needed to distinguish him from other family members. Can you imagine keeping all of this straight in every conversation? Having to know not just everyone's names, but their family structure, their birth order, their titles, their relative social position to you. It required constant mental calculation, and mistakes were noticed. If you called someone Miss Smith when they were actually the eldest daughter and should be Miss Surname only, people would know you did not know the family well. If you used a first name inappropriately, you were either ignorant or deliberately overstepping boundaries. Either way, you had marked yourself as someone who did not fully understand the social rules. The etiquette guides of the era tried to help navigate this complexity. The Mirror of Graces from 1811 advises that a young lady must be careful in the use of names, ensuring she maintains proper distance with all but her nearest relations. On another guide, The Habits of Good Society, published in the 1850s, but reflecting earlier customs, states explicitly, "Never address a gentleman or lady by their Christian name unless you are on terms of the greatest intimacy." Christian name, by the way, was the term used for what we call first names or given names, and greatest intimacy meant family or very close friends of many years' standing, not casual acquaintances, not people you liked but had only known for a season or two. Here is a question that really gets at the heart of this. What did it mean for personal relationships when you could not use first names? Did it make connections feel more distant, more artificial? I think yes and no. On one hand, the formality created a barrier. It reminded you constantly of social roles and expectations. You could not forget yourself. You could not become too casual, too comfortable, too real. There was always this layer of performance between you and the other person. But on the other hand, when you finally did get to use someone's first name, when you crossed that threshold, it meant something profound. It was not taken for granted. It was earned. It marked a genuine intimacy that had been acknowledged and accepted by both parties. When Elizabeth Bennet finally has the right to call Mr. Darcy Fitzwilliam, it is a bigger moment than any physical touch they might share. It is the verbal consummation of their relationship. It says, "We are no longer performing social roles with each other. We are real. We are connected in a way that transcends the formal world." There were also regional variations in how strictly these rules were followed. In London and at fashionable resorts like Bath or Brighton, the rules were most stringent. Everyone was watching everyone else. Reputations were made and destroyed in these places. You could not afford to be casual. But in the country, especially in small villages where everyone knew everyone else, things relaxed slightly. Not dramatically, the basic rules still held, but there might be more tolerance for minor informalities between families who had known each other for generations. And then there were the rebels, because there are always rebels. Some people in the Regency era pushed back against the formality. They found it stifling and ridiculous. Lord Byron, for instance, was notorious for disregarding social conventions. He would use first names with people he barely knew. He would address women with an intimacy that shocked polite society. And he got away with it partly because he was brilliant and charismatic, partly because he was rich and titled, and partly because he genuinely did not care what people thought. But for every Byron who broke the rules and became famous for it, there were dozens of people who broke the rules and simply became outcasts. I want to talk for a moment about married women because their naming situation was particularly interesting. When a woman married, she took her husband's surname. That was automatic, but she also lost her first name in formal situations. She became Mrs. Husband's full name. So if Elizabeth Bennet married Fitzwilliam Darcy, she would be called Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy in formal contexts, not Mrs. Elizabeth Darcy. She took on his entire name as her own. It was a complete absorption of her identity into his. In informal situations, among friends and family, she might be called by her first name, but in society she was defined entirely by her relationship to her husband. Widows and divorced women had their own complex naming conventions. A widow kept her late husband's name, but might eventually revert to using her own first name with it. So Mrs. John Smith might become Mrs. Mary Smith after a period of mourning. Divorced women, though divorce was extremely rare and scandalous, often reverted to their maiden names or became social non-entities because polite society did not really know how to categorize them. The naming system was built around clear categories. Unmarried woman, married woman, widow. Divorce broke the system. Here is something I find both touching and sad. In letters between family members from this era, you can see the warmth that existed despite the formal language. A mother might write to her daughter, calling her "my dear girl" or "dearest child" rather than using her name at all. Terms of endearment replaced names in private family correspondence. It was a way to express affection within the constraints of the system. You could not always be informal, but you could be loving. The care came through despite the rules. And what about nicknames? They existed, but they were very private. Pet names between spouses, childhood nicknames among siblings, these were not for public consumption. If you had a nickname, it was something used at home, behind closed doors. Revealing someone's nickname in public would be like sharing an intimate secret. It was a breach of the boundary between public and private selves. Think about what all of this means for small talk, which is ostensibly what we've been exploring this whole time. How do you make genuine connections with people when you are trapped in this formal language? How do you express friendship, affection, interest when you have to call someone Mr. Smith or Miss Jones for months or even years? The answer is that you found other ways. Tone of voice became crucial. The warmth in how you said Miss Elizabeth could convey volumes. The smile that accompanied Mr. Darcy could transform a formal address into something personal. Looks, gestures, the topics you chose to discuss, the private jokes you developed within the formal framework, these became the channels through which real feeling flowed. And maybe there is something beautiful about that, about having to work that hard to communicate genuine connection, about valuing the small permissions to write letters, to visit, to eventually use a first name, as the significant milestones they were. In our world, where we jump to first names within minutes of meeting someone, where informality is the default, we have gained ease and equality. But we have lost that sense of progression, of earning intimacy, of names as gifts rather than assumptions. So the next time you casually call someone by their first name, someone you have just met or barely know, take a moment to appreciate that freedom. You're not navigating a complex system of titles and formality. You're not calculating whether you've earned the right to that level of address. You are just being human with another human. And that is a privilege people in 1815 would have envied deeply. But names and forms of address were just the beginning of the elaborate choreography of Regency social interaction. Because even once you knew what to call someone, you still had to know how to greet them physically. The art of bowing and curtsying was its own complex language, with depth of bow and angle of body communicating respect, rank, and relationship. Getting it wrong? Well, that could be just as mortifying as using the wrong name. So let us dive into the Olympics of physical greetings, where your body became a message and every angle mattered. Your body was a language. Every inclination of your head, every bend of your knee, every angle of your spine communicated something specific about who you were, who the other person was, and what kind of relationship existed between you. The bow and the curtsy were not just polite gestures. They were precision instruments of social messaging. And like everything else in Regency England, there were rules. So many rules. Rules about how deep to bow, how long to hold the position, whether to maintain eye contact, when to rise. Get it right and you demonstrated breeding, respect and social awareness. Get it wrong and you had just broadcast to everyone watching that you were either ignorant or insulting, sometimes both. Let us start with the ladies, because their curtsy was perhaps the most technically demanding piece of physical etiquette in the entire Regency repertoire. Imagine you are a young woman being trained in proper deportment. You are perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Your mother or a governess is teaching you how to curtsy. And this is not a simple knee bend. This is choreography. This is ballet without the music. You stand with your feet in a specific position, one slightly behind the other. Your back must be perfectly straight. Your shoulders remain level. Your head inclines slightly, just slightly forward, and then you bend, but not from the knees like we might imagine. The curtsy came from bending the knees while keeping the back straight, then lowering the body in a smooth, controlled descent. The depth of the curtsy communicated everything. A slight curtsy, just a small dip, barely noticeable, was appropriate for equals or near equals. Someone of similar social standing, someone you knew well but were not related to. This was the everyday curtsy, the one you would use dozens of times at any social gathering. A medium curtsy went deeper. This showed respect to someone slightly above you in rank, or to an older person deserving of particular regard. And then there was the deep curtsy, the grand reverence, the one that required real leg strength and balance. This was for royalty, for people of significantly higher rank, for your first presentation at court. This curtsy involved lowering yourself so far that your back knee almost touched the ground, and you had to hold it there, perfectly balanced, until the other person acknowledged you. Then you had to rise smoothly, gracefully, without wobbling or losing your balance. The etiquette manuals were very specific about this. The Ladies' Pocket Book of Etiquette, published in 1840 but reflecting earlier customs, states, "The curtsy should be performed with grace and modesty, neither too shallow as to suggest disrespect, nor so deep as to appear affected or insincere." Finding that perfect middle ground required practice, hours and hours of practice. Young girls would practice their curtsies until their legs ached. Because a ball or important social event, you might need to curtsy 30 or 40 times in a single evening. To the hostess when you arrived, to the host, to anyone of higher rank than yourself, to dance partners, to anyone being formally introduced. Your legs needed to be strong enough to handle it. And here is something that rarely gets mentioned. Curtsying in the elaborate gowns of the period was genuinely difficult. The dresses were heavy. The empire waistline, sitting just below the bust, meant the fabric fell straight down from there, giving you limited visibility of your own feet. The hems often had elaborate trim that could catch on your shoes if you were not careful, and if you were wearing a ball gown with additional ornamentation, maybe some beading or embroidery, that added weight and restricted movement. Executing a perfect curtsy in all of that without tripping, without your dress making strange bunching movements, without accidentally stepping on your hem and tearing it, that required skill. Now let us talk about the gentlemen, because their bows were equally codified. A gentleman's bow came from the waist. The back stayed relatively straight, and you bent forward from the hips. The depth of the bow communicated the same hierarchy as the curtsy. A small bow, a nod really, just a slight forward inclination, was for equals. A medium bow, perhaps 30 degrees forward, showed respect to someone of higher standing or older age. A deep bow, nearly 45 degrees or more, was reserved for the most important occasions and people. And unlike the curtsy, which was primarily for women, men were bowing constantly, to every lady they encountered, to their social superiors, to their hosts. The bow was the default greeting gesture for men in almost every situation. But here is where it gets interesting. The bow was not just about bending forward. There was a whole vocabulary of gesture that accompanied it. You might remove your hat before bowing, holding it in your hand at a specific angle, or you might touch the brim of your hat while bowing slightly, a more casual acknowledgement. Your free hand might be placed over your heart for a particularly respectful bow. Your eyes might remain fixed on the other person, or they might lower modestly to the ground. Every variation meant something different. Every choice communicated a message. Dr. John Trussler, in his 1805 Etiquette Guide, specifies that a gentleman must never bow with exaggerated motion, as this suggests mockery rather than respect. This is fascinating because it means some men were bowing in ways that came across as sarcastic. Can you imagine? Someone bows to you, but they bow too deeply, too theatrically, and suddenly everyone realizes they are actually insulting you through over-the-top fake politeness. The bow as weapon, the bow as satire. It must have been devastating to be on the receiving end of that. There was also the question of who bowed or curtsied first. The rules here were clear. The person of lower rank acknowledged the person of higher rank first. So a gentleman always bowed to a lady before she curtsied in return. Ladies automatically outranked men in terms of social courtesy. A younger person acknowledged an older person first. An unmarried woman acknowledged a married woman first. If you were unsure of the exact hierarchy, you erred on the side of caution and bowed or curtsied first. Better to be overly polite than to accidentally insult someone by waiting for them to acknowledge you first when you should have initiated. But here is where human nature complicated things. Sometimes people bowed or curtsied at the exact same moment. Then what? Technically, the person of lower rank should recover first and bow or curtsy again to acknowledge that the other person's initial gesture was received and understood. But if both people were trying to do this, if both people were trying to out-polite each other, you could end up in an absurd situation where two people kept bowing and curtsying at each other in an infinite loop of deference. The etiquette guides actually address this. The solution was for the higher-ranking person to acknowledge the exchange with a smile or nod and simply move on, releasing everyone from the obligation to continue. Let me tell you about one of the most nerve-wracking bow and curtsy situations imaginable, being presented at court. When a young woman made her debut in society, if her family had the right connections and social standing, she would be presented to the Queen. This happened at special court events called drawing rooms, and the curtsy required for meeting royalty was the most extreme, the most technically demanding, the most anxiety-inducing curtsy you could possibly perform. First, you were wearing a court dress, which was even more elaborate than a regular ball gown. It had a train, a long piece of fabric that extended behind you. It had hoops in the skirt to make it wider. It had feathers in your hair. 3 ostrich feathers was traditional for debutantes. You were dressed like a wedding cake topper. And in all of this, you had to approach the Queen, execute a perfect deep curtsy, hold it while she acknowledged you with a nod, and then rise gracefully. Then you had to turn and walk backwards, while managing your train, without tripping, without losing your feathers, without bumping into anyone. Women practiced for weeks before their presentation. Some hired professional instructors to teach them the specific court curtsy. And still things went wrong, feathers fell out. Women lost their balance and toppled over. Trains got tangled. It was a high-wire act performed in front of the most important audience imaginable. The Duchess of Devonshire, one of the most famous society figures of the late 1700s and early 1800s, once described watching a young woman's disastrous court presentation in a letter to her sister. The poor girl apparently curtsied too deeply, lost her balance, and actually fell over in front of the Queen. She had to be helped up by attendants. The humiliation was total. The story spread through society within hours. That young woman's debut was defined by that single failed curtsy. For years afterward, people remembered her as the girl who fell at court. Now you might be wondering, did anyone ever refuse to bow or curtsy? Did anyone rebel against this system? The answer is yes, but rarely, and with serious consequences. In Regency society, refusing to bow or curtsy to someone was called cutting, but on a physical rather than verbal level. If you saw someone and deliberately did not perform the expected gesture of acknowledgement, you were sending a message of complete contempt. This was different from the verbal cutting we discussed earlier. This was your body refusing to show respect, and it was shocking. Witnesses would gasp, gossip would explode, the person who was cut would be devastated, and the person doing the cutting would be the subject of intense speculation. What had happened between them? What offence had been committed? There is a famous historical example from slightly before the Regency period that shows how serious this was. In 1788, Princess Amelia, the daughter of King George III, cut Lady Salisbury at a public event. She literally looked right at Lady Salisbury, who had curtsied deeply and turned away without any acknowledgement whatsoever. The slight was so shocking that it made the newspapers. Speculation ran wild about what Lady Salisbury could possibly have done to deserve such treatment from a princess. Months later, it came out that Lady Salisbury had supposedly made some critical comments about the royal family. The princess's physical cut was her way of expressing royal displeasure, and Lady Salisbury's social standing never fully recovered. But most of the time people bowed and curtsied as expected, even when they disliked each other, even when they were furious with each other. You might be nursing a grudge against someone, you might be plotting revenge, but when you encountered them in public, you performed the expected gesture of acknowledgement. Because the alternative, the public cut, the refusal to bow, was nuclear. It was the end of any relationship, the declaration of social war. Most disagreements were not worth that level of escalation. Here is something I find particularly fascinating. Children were trained in bowing and curtsying from a very young age. Toddlers would practice curtsying to their parents and older relatives. Little boys would learn to bow before they could write their names. This was not considered cute or optional. This was essential education. You had to internalize these gestures so completely that they became automatic. By the time you were old enough to enter society, bowing and curtsying had to be second nature. You could not be thinking about the mechanics. You had to be able to execute a perfect curtsy while simultaneously engaging in conversation, while watching other people, while navigating a crowded room. It was like learning to drive a car while also juggling and solving math problems. The emphasis on physical training for girls was particularly intense. Young ladies might practice curtsying for an hour or more each day. They would curtsy to their governess, to their mothers, to each other. They would practice different depths of curtsy. They would practice recovering from a curtsy smoothly. They would practice curtsying in their regular clothes and then in ball gowns to get used to the different weight and movement. It was athletic training disguised as etiquette education, and it was exhausting. There is a wonderful account in the diary of Lady Sarah Spencer, a young aristocrat in the early 1800s, where she describes preparing for her first major ball. She writes about practicing her curtsy until my legs trembled and my back ached, and about her mother's critical eye noting every slight imperfection. Too shallow, her mother would say, too deep, too slow. Watch your shoulders. Lady Sarah writes that by the time the ball actually arrived, she was so anxious about her curtsy that she barely enjoyed the event. She was performing, not participating, and this brings up a question. What did all of this physical formality do to genuine human connection? When every greeting required a calculated gesture, when you could not simply smile and wave but had to execute a precisely calibrated bow or curtsy, did it make relationships feel more distant, more artificial? I think the answer is complicated. On one hand, yes, the constant formality created barriers. It reminded everyone of hierarchy and social distance. It made casual, spontaneous interaction nearly impossible. Every encounter was staged. But on the other hand, there was a kind of grace to it. When you see historical films set in this period, the good ones anyway, that hire proper movement coaches, and you watch people bow and curtsy to each other, there is something genuinely beautiful about it. The movements are elegant. They require body awareness and control. They create a rhythm to social interaction that is almost dance-like. Everyone knows the steps. Everyone performs them together. And there is something comforting about that level of structure, even if it is also constraining. Plus, within the formal framework, tiny variations could communicate real feeling. A curtsy held just a moment longer than necessary could convey special warmth or respect. A bow with particular eye contact could signal genuine regard rather than mere social obligation. The smile that accompanied the gesture, the warmth in your eyes, the tone of your voice as you spoke the formal greeting, these human elements existed within and around the physical protocol. People found ways to be real with each other despite the constraints. There is a scene in Emma by Jane Austen where Emma Woodhouse encounters Harriet Smith and her new husband at a social gathering. Emma curtsies, Harriet curtsies, but Austen describes the quality of the curtsy, the expression on Harriet's face, the obvious happiness and forgiveness in the gesture. The curtsy is not just a formality in this moment. It is communication. It says, "We are well. Our friendship has survived. I am happy." All of that conveyed through body language within the required social form. So what happened to all of this? When did people stop bowing and curtsying with such elaborate precision? The short answer is, gradually. The formality began to relax in the mid-1800s. The middle class was expanding and bringing with them slightly more casual attitudes. International influence from America and the continent introduced different social styles. By the late Victorian period, bows were becoming shallower and curtsies less frequent. By the 1920s, after World War I shattered so many social conventions, the elaborate bowing and curtsying system had largely collapsed, except for very formal occasions. Today we curtsy to royalty and basically no one else. The bow has become a handshake. We have traded elaborate physical formality for casual physical contact, handshakes, hugs, sometimes even kisses on the cheek with people we barely know. Have we lost something? Maybe. There was dignity in those formal gestures. There was respect built into the very structure of greeting someone. But we have gained so much more. We have gained ease. We have gained equality. No more calculating who bows or curtsies first based on rank. We have gained the freedom to be casual, to relax, to not worry about whether our knees are bending at the correct angle. Most of us would not trade back. But imagine for a moment what it would be like to live in a world where every greeting required that kind of conscious effort and grace, where your body had to speak a formal language before your voice could, where simply saying hello involved choreography. It would be beautiful and exhausting in equal measure, and it would remind you constantly that you are part of a social order larger than yourself, bound by traditions and expectations that stretched back generations, for better and for worse. Speaking of traditions that stretched back generations and expectations that were taken incredibly seriously, we need to talk about one of the most elaborate social rituals of the entire Regency period, the calling card system. Because if you think bowing and curtsying were complicated, wait until you hear about the intricate dance of leaving cards, returning visits, and the complex social mathematics of who owed whom what kind of acknowledgement. This was the Regency version of social media, except instead of following people online, you were literally tracking their social visits. And the rules? Absolutely Byzantine. Let us dive into the world of pasteboard rectangles that could make or break your social life. Before Facebook friend requests, before LinkedIn connections, before Instagram follows, there were calling cards. Small rectangles of expensive cardstock elegantly engraved with your name and address that served as your passport into society. And the system surrounding these innocent-looking pieces of paper was so complex, so laden with unspoken rules and subtle meanings, that you could communicate entire social narratives through the simple act of folding a corner or leaving a card at a specific time of day. This was not just etiquette. This was a sophisticated social technology that tracked relationships, signaled intentions, and created obligations. And understanding it was absolutely essential to survival in polite society. Let me show you how this actually worked. Imagine you've just moved to a new neighbourhood in London for the social season. Your family has taken a house in a fashionable area, maybe Grosvenor Square or somewhere near Hyde Park. You are new to the area, but you have social standing, you are respectable, you want to be accepted into local society. So what do? You cannot simply knock on people's doors and introduce yourself. That would be horrifyingly forward. Instead, you wait. You wait for the established residents to acknowledge your presence. And how do they do that? By leaving their cards. The system worked like this. If you were already established in an area, and a new family of appropriate social standing moved in, it was your responsibility to call on them first. You would have your servant deliver your calling card to their home. This card announced your existence, your interest in making acquaintance, and your willingness to receive them. It was the equivalent of sending a friend request. And that card sitting on the silver tray in their entrance hall created an obligation. The new family now owed you a return visit. They had to acknowledge your overture within a specific time frame, usually within a week, though the etiquette guides varied on exact timing, or risk appearing rude or uninterested in forming connections. But here is where it gets deliciously complicated. The calling card itself could convey different messages depending on how it was left. A card left in person, meaning you actually went to the house, knocked on the door and handed your card to the servant, was more significant than a card sent via your own servant. It showed extra effort, extra interest. And once the card was left, you could modify its meaning by folding certain corners. Are you ready for this? Because the corner folding code was like secret messaging in plain sight. According to the Habits of Good Society and similar etiquette manuals, here is what the folds meant. Folding down the top right corner indicated that you had called in person rather than just sending a servant. Folding the top left corner meant the visit was intended for the entire family, not just the lady of the house. Folding the bottom right corner signalled congratulations. Folding the bottom left corner expressed condolences. Some guides listed additional meanings. One corner fold might indicate you were leaving town, another might signal that you would not be at home for visits for a period. It was like emoji before emoji existed, except much more formal and with the potential to cause offence if you got it wrong. Now, imagine you are the recipient of these cards. They arrive on your silver tray, and you have to decode them. You have to remember who sent which card, what the folded corners meant, and what kind of return visit you owed. Because not all return visits were equal. If someone of higher social rank left you a card, you owed them a personal call. You had to actually go to their house during calling hours and present yourself, but if someone of equal or lower rank left a card, you could sometimes return the courtesy by simply leaving your own card without actually calling in person. The mathematics of social obligation was precise and unforgiving. Let us talk about calling hours, because even these were rigidly defined. The fashionable hours for paying calls were between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. Why these hours specifically? Well, morning was too early. People might still be dealing with household business or personal matters. The time around noon was luncheon. Late afternoon and evening were reserved for preparing for dinner or evening entertainments. But those 2 hours between 3 and 5, that was when you were expected to be presentable, properly dressed, and available to receive visitors or to go visiting yourself. And the visits themselves were timed. 15 to 20 minutes was the appropriate length for a social call, not 10 minutes. That would seem like you could not wait to leave. Not 30 minutes. That would suggest you were overstaying your welcome, or worse, that you had nothing better to do. 15 to 20 minutes was the sweet spot. You arrived, you were shown into the drawing room, you engaged in pleasant small talk, you admired something in the room perhaps, you carefully avoided controversial topics, and then you made your excuses and departed. The whole interaction was choreographed. Here is a detail that really brings this to life. You were not supposed to remove your gloves during a brief social call. Removing your gloves suggested you were settling in for a long visit, which was inappropriate unless you had been specifically invited for an extended stay. Your gloves stayed on. You held your additional calling cards in your gloved hand. Yes, you brought cards with you when you went calling, because if the person you were visiting was not at home, you would leave your card as evidence that you had attempted the visit. Every step had a rule, every gesture had meaning. But what happened if you were not at home when someone called? This is where things get even more interesting. Not at home did not necessarily mean you were literally out of the house. It was a polite fiction. Not at home could mean you were genuinely absent. Or it could mean you were home but not receiving visitors that day. Maybe you were unwell, maybe you were busy, maybe you simply did not feel like entertaining. Your servant would answer the door, take the visitor's card and inform them that you were not at home. The visitor would leave their card and depart. No offence taken because everyone understood the code. However, there was a catch. If someone called and you were not at home repeatedly, it started to send a message. 1 time, fine. 2, acceptable, life is complicated. 3 times? People started to wonder if you were deliberately avoiding them. If you were consistently not at home to someone who kept trying to call, you were essentially performing a soft cut. You were not being openly rude, but you were making it clear that you did not wish to cultivate the acquaintance, and the person being rejected would eventually get the hint and stop calling. Their cards would stop arriving. The relationship would die a quiet, bloodless death. There is a brilliant example of this in Jane Austen's Persuasion. Sir Walter Elliot is desperate to reconnect with his cousin Lady Dalrymple, who outranks him socially. He leaves his card, he waits anxiously for her to return the call, or at least send her card. Days pass. He obsesses over whether she will acknowledge the relationship. When her card finally arrives, he is triumphant. The connection has been recognized, but imagine if her card had never come. Imagine the humiliation of that silence. Everyone would know he had tried to claim kinship with a titled relation and been rejected. The calling card system made these power dynamics visible and trackable. Now let us talk about the physical cards themselves, because even these were status symbols. Calling cards were made from thick, high-quality cardstock. They were engraved, not printed engraved, with your name and address in elegant script. The quality of the paper, the elegance of the font, the precision of the engraving, all of this communicated your wealth and taste. A shabby calling card suggested financial difficulties or poor breeding. A beautifully produced card, perhaps with a subtle border or a family crest, announced that you were someone of consequence. The size and shape of the cards were also standardized to some degree, though with variations. A gentleman's card was typically smaller and simpler, just his name and address, perhaps his club if he belonged to one. A married woman's card might include her husband's name as well as her own. An unmarried woman's card was typically somewhere between the two in size, and the cards were expensive. Having a supply of properly engraved calling cards made was a significant expense, especially for families with multiple adult members who each needed their own cards. There were specialist shops in fashionable areas. London's Bond Street had several, where you could order your cards. You would choose your font, your paper stock, possibly a border design. The engraving process took time and cost money, but it was money you had to spend. Without proper calling cards, you could not fully participate in social life. It would be like trying to network today without business cards or a LinkedIn profile. Technically possible, but putting yourself at a massive disadvantage. Here is something I find both clever and slightly sad. There were guidebooks specifically about calling card etiquette. Entire books devoted to explaining when to leave cards, how to fold them, how quickly to return visits, what to do in various social scenarios involving cards. The Laws of Etiquette, published in 1836, devotes multiple chapters to the subject. The fact that people needed guidebooks about pieces of paper tells you how complex and how high stakes the system was. One mistake in the calling card ritual could damage your social standing. People were genuinely anxious about getting it right. Let me walk you through a specific scenario to show you how complicated this could get. Imagine you are invited to a dinner party. You attend, you have a lovely time, and now you owe your hosts a thank you visit. But you cannot just show up whenever you feel like it. You have to wait the appropriate amount of time, typically a day or two, but not so long that you appear ungrateful. You then call during the prescribed hours, or you leave your card if they're not at home. But what if they had other guests at that dinner party? Do you owe calls to everyone you met there? Not necessarily. But if you had particularly pleasant conversations with certain people, you might want to acknowledge that by leaving your card at their homes as well, and they might reciprocate. And now you've created new social obligations. You've expanded your calling card network. It was exponential. The social season in London, roughly January through July, was particularly intense for calling card exchange. Everyone was in town, everyone was socializing, everyone was trying to maintain existing connections and create new ones. Families would go through hundreds of calling cards during the season. Servants would spend hours each week just delivering cards around town, and households would keep careful records of who had called, when they had called, whether the visit had been returned, who still needed to be visited. It was social bookkeeping, it was relationship accounting, and it was exhausting, but there was something rather lovely about it too, if you think about it from a certain angle. The calling card system created structure. It created predictability. You knew what you owed people and what they owed you. You knew the rules, even if they were complex. Compare that to modern social media, where the rules are murky and constantly changing. Do you need to like someone's post? Should you comment? If they follow you, do you have to follow back? What if they unfriend you? There is anxiety in that ambiguity. The calling card system, for all its complexity, at least had clear protocols. If someone left you a card, you knew exactly what you were expected to do in response, and the physical nature of it mattered. A calling card was a tangible object. You could hold it in your hand, you could arrange your cards on a tray and see your social network literally spread out before you. You could save special cards as mementos. Some people kept scrapbooks of calling cards from notable people they had met. It was a physical archive of social connections in a way that a digital friend list can never quite replicate. There were, of course, people who tried to game the system. Social climbers who would leave cards at the homes of important people hoping to force an acquaintance. These attempts rarely worked. The important people would simply never return the call, never acknowledge the card. The obligation would go unfulfilled, and everyone would understand what had happened. The social climber had overreached. They had tried to punch above their weight, and the silence that followed their card was its own form of rejection. There is a wonderful satirical piece from the 1820s, I believe it was in the Mirror of Fashion magazine, that mocks the calling card obsession. It describes a woman so consumed with tracking her social obligations that she creates elaborate charts and graphs of who owes whom visits. She assigns point values to different types of calls. She calculates her social standing mathematically. It is obviously exaggerated for comic effect, but it resonates because it is based in truth. People really were that concerned about the social mathematics of calling cards and visits. But by the mid-1800s, the system was starting to crack. As the middle class expanded, as cities became more crowded, as life became busier and more complicated, the elaborate calling card ritual began to seem excessive. People started bending the rules. The etiquette guides started offering more flexibility. By the late Victorian period, you could send cards via post rather than having them hand-delivered. The corner folding code simplified or was abandoned altogether, and by the early 200s, the calling card was becoming more of a formality than an actual social tool. Today we still have business cards, which are direct descendants of calling cards, but the elaborate social ritual around them, that has vanished completely. Have you ever thought about how we track social obligations now? We might mentally note that we owe someone a text response or that we should reach out to someone we have not talked to in a while. But there is no formal system, no clear rules about how quickly we must respond or what kind of response we owe. On one hand, this is freeing. We have flexibility, we can be casual, but on the other hand, it creates anxiety. Without clear rules, we are never quite sure if we're doing enough. Are we being a good friend? Are we neglecting people? Are we responding too quickly and seeming needy, or too slowly and seeming indifferent? Maybe the calling card system, for all its formality, provided a kind of clarity we have lost. So the next time you get a notification that someone has followed you on social media or sent you a connection request, think about the ghosts of calling cards past. Think about the servants in livery delivering elegant pieces of engraved pasteboard around Georgian London. Think about the anxiety of waiting to see if someone would return your call. Think about the whole elaborate infrastructure of social obligation that existed before we could just click accept or ignore. We have gained so much efficiency, but we have lost something too. We have lost the ritual, the tangibility, the clear language of social connection that those calling cards provided. But as elaborate as the calling card system was, it only worked when people were behaving sincerely, when they were being genuine within the formal framework. And that is not always what happened, because underneath all of this etiquette, all of these rules about bows and cards and proper address, there was a deeper tension. Women especially were expected to perform a very specific kind of femininity. They were supposed to be delicate, weak, in need of protection. They were supposed to faint decorously when upset and never show too much emotional strength. And yet, paradoxically, they also had to be strong enough to manage households, raise children, and navigate the treacherous waters of social life. So how did women reconcile this impossible contradiction? They became performers. They mastered the art of fake weakness, and that strange performance of fragility is exactly what we are exploring next. The ideal Regency woman was a walking contradiction. She was supposed to be delicate as porcelain, fragile as a flower, so sensitive that the slightest upset could send her into a swoon. And yet somehow she was also supposed to be strong enough to bear and raise multiple children, manage an entire household, supervise servants, handle family finances, and navigate the brutal social landscape we have been exploring. She was meant to embody weakness and strength simultaneously, and the solution to this impossible paradox: performance. Women learned to perform fragility so convincingly that it became its own kind of power. They mastered the art of strategic swooning, decorative weakness, and carefully calibrated emotional displays, and it was exhausting. Let us start with the basic expectation, the foundation of this whole bizarre construct. According to The Mirror of Graces, published in 1811, the ideal woman should combine female weakness with the dynamics of a mother. This is literally asking women to be weak and strong at the same time. The guide elaborates. A lady should appear sweet in need of protection, while also being capable of showing harsh affection and love. Try to picture that. Try to imagine being told you need to seem helpless while also being competent. Seem fragile while also being resilient. It is like being asked to be hot and cold simultaneously. And yet this was the standard. This was what society demanded of women. So what did this look like in practice? Well, women were expected to display physical weakness as a sign of refinement. A truly genteel lady was supposed to have a delicate constitution. She might feel faint at the slightest provocation. Strong emotions overwhelmed her. Shocking news caused her to collapse. Violent scenes made her turn away in horror, perhaps even lose consciousness. The more delicate you were, the more refined you appeared. Robustness was associated with lower classes, with farm girls and working women who needed physical strength. But a lady was fragile. Except, of course, she was not really. Women in the Regency period were not actually more prone to fainting than women at any other time in history. They did not have weaker constitutions or more sensitive nervous systems. What they had was social pressure to perform weakness, and so they did. They learned how to faint gracefully. Yes, gracefully. There was a right way and a wrong way to swoon. You did not just drop like a stone. That would be undignified and possibly cause injury. Instead, you felt faint. You placed a hand to your forehead or your heart, you swayed slightly, and you allowed yourself to sink gently into the nearest chair, or into the arms of the nearest gentleman, if one was conveniently positioned. It was choreographed. It was theatre. The etiquette manuals actually gave guidance on this. The Young Lady's Friend, a conduct book published in 1837 but reflecting earlier attitudes, discusses how a lady should respond to distressing situations. It suggests that showing shock or distress is appropriate, in fact, necessary, to prove one's sensitivity and moral refinement. But it also warns against excessive displays of emotion that might appear vulgar. So you had to find the perfect middle ground. Shocked enough to prove your delicacy, not so shocked that you lost control entirely. It was a tightrope walk. And what kinds of things were supposed to provoke these delicate reactions? Almost anything, according to the rules. Hearing about violence, faint, witnessing an argument, feel faint, someone uses vulgar language in your presence, shocked silence, possible swooning, seeing something indecent, immediate distress. The world was full of potential triggers, and a proper lady was supposed to react to all of them with visible fragility. But here is what makes this fascinating. Everyone knew it was at least partially performance. The men knew, other women knew, the women performing it certainly knew. There are letters and diaries from the period where women drop the pretense and talk honestly about how exhausting it was to maintain this facade. One letter from a young woman in 1816 to her sister says something like, and I am paraphrasing from memory, but the sentiment is clear, "I am quite worn out from being delicate all evening. My head aches from tilting it just so, and my hand is tired from being pressed dramatically to my forehead whenever anyone said something they considered shocking." The corset played into this as well, though perhaps not in the way you might think. Yes, corsets restricted breathing and could cause women to feel genuinely faint, especially if they were laced too tightly. But the fainting was not always accidental. Some women deliberately wore their corsets extremely tight because the resulting breathlessness and paleness reinforced the image of delicacy. A woman who could barely breathe was clearly a woman of refinement. She had never done manual labor. She had never needed to move vigorously. She was ornamental, decorative, a piece of beautiful fragility, and that perversely gave her value in the marriage market. Men wanted to marry delicate women, because delicate women came from good families who could afford to raise daughters who never had to work. Now, let us talk about the paradox at the heart of all this, because while women were performing weakness in public, they were managing incredible responsibilities in private. A married woman of the middle or upper classes was running what was essentially a small business. She supervised servants, sometimes dozens of them. She managed household accounts, which could be complex and substantial. She oversaw the education of her children. She handled social obligations, correspondence, visiting, entertaining. She dealt with suppliers, tradesmen, and the constant logistics of keeping a household functioning. This required intelligence, organization, strength, and decisiveness, none of which were supposed to be feminine qualities. So how did women reconcile this? They compartmentalized. In public, in social situations, they performed delicacy. They swooned on cue. They appeared shocked at appropriate moments. They demonstrated their refinement through strategic weakness. But in private, in their homes, they were competent and capable. They made decisions, they gave orders, they managed and directed and handled crises. The performance of weakness was just that, a performance. It was what society required of them in public, but it was not who they actually were. There is a beautiful moment in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility that captures this perfectly. Marianne Dashwood is the epitome of sensibility, emotionally expressive, openly feeling, prone to dramatic reactions. When she is disappointed in love, she falls genuinely ill from grief. She is not performing, she is truly overwhelmed by emotion, and the novel treats this as excessive, as dangerous even. Marianne nearly dies from her inability to control or moderate her feelings. In contrast, her sister Eleanor embodies sense. She feels just as deeply. Her heartbreak over Edward Ferrars is just as painful as Marianne's over Willoughby. But Eleanor contains it. She manages it. She performs composure while suffering privately, and the novel rewards Eleanor for this. Her self-control and her ability to function despite her pain are presented as superior to Marianne's emotional excess. This was the real message society was sending to women. Feel whatever you want, but control how you express it. Display appropriate delicacy, but do not let it actually incapacitate you. Be weak enough to need protection, but strong enough to never actually be a burden. It was an impossible balance, and it created enormous psychological pressure. The medical establishment of the period reinforced these expectations in fascinating and troubling ways. Doctors diagnosed women with all sorts of vague ailments that essentially pathologized femininity itself. Nervous disorders, hysteria, weakness of constitution, delicate health. These were not considered abnormal for women. They were considered almost inevitable. And the treatments? Rest, confinement, limited physical activity. Essentially, women were being told that being female meant being somewhat ill, and the cure was to do even less, be even more sedentary, become even more dependent. It was circular logic that kept women locked into the performance of weakness. But some women pushed back. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her groundbreaking A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, argued that women were not naturally weak. They were made weak by a society that treated them as delicate ornaments instead of rational human beings. She wrote, "Taught from their infancy that beauty is woman's sceptre, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming round its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison." She was arguing that the performance of weakness was a trap. By pretending to be delicate, women were actually making themselves dependent and powerless. It was a radical argument for the time, and it was largely ignored or mocked by mainstream society. But it planted seeds, it started conversation. Let me tell you about a specific historical example that shows just how absurd the weakness expectation could become. In 1811, when Princess Charlotte, the daughter of the Prince Regent and heir to the British throne, was in her late teens, there was serious concern among her advisors about her health. Not because she was actually ill, because she was too robust. She enjoyed riding horses, she walked briskly. She had opinions she expressed forcefully. She was, by all accounts, physically healthy and mentally sharp. And this worried people. A princess, they felt, should be more refined, more delicate. There were actual discussions about how to make her seem more fragile, more appropriately feminine. This was the future Queen of England, and people were concerned that she was too healthy. The irony, of course, is that women needed significant physical strength to survive the medical realities of the era. Childbirth was dangerous, women often had many pregnancies in quick succession. Infant mortality was high, which meant women experienced the repeated trauma of losing children. Disease was common, medical care was primitive and sometimes more harmful than helpful. Surviving to middle age required a robust constitution. The delicate, fragile woman of social imagination would have been dead by 30. The real women of the Regency were tough. They had to be, but they had to pretend they were not. And this brings up an interesting question. Did any women benefit from this system? Did strategic weakness ever work in women's favour? The answer is complicated, but yes, sometimes. A woman who successfully performed delicacy could attract a protective husband who would shield her from certain harsh realities. She could use claimed weakness as an excuse to avoid unpleasant situations or obligations. "I am afraid my delicate constitution could not bear it," was a socially acceptable way to say no to things you did not want to do. And in an era when women had very few direct forms of power, these indirect methods were sometimes the only tools available. There is also the fact that men often genuinely believed in female delicacy, which meant women could use it strategically. If men thought women were too delicate to understand finance or politics, women might be underestimated in those areas, and underestimation can be its own kind of advantage. There are documented cases of women managing family estates brilliantly, while their husbands thought they were just doing simple household accounts. The performance of incompetence masked actual competence, and sometimes this worked in women's favour. But mostly the performance of weakness was exhausting and demeaning. It required women to deny their own strength, intelligence, and capability. It created a disconnect between public persona and private reality that must have been psychologically damaging. And it taught women to value themselves for their fragility rather than their competence. The cost was high. Think about the emotional labour involved in this. Every time you felt strong emotions, anger, passion, ambition, frustration, you had to carefully modulate how you expressed them. Too much feeling and you were hysterical. Too little and you were cold. You had to be Goldilocks with your emotions, finding the exact right amount of display to prove you were feminine without being excessive. And this was daily work. This was constant self-monitoring and self-censorship. Is it any wonder that the literature of the period is full of women suffering from nerves and retiring to their rooms with headaches. The language used to describe ideal femininity reinforces all of this. Women were flowers, birds, delicate creatures who needed protection. They were never described as strong, capable, resilient, even though they demonstrably were all of those things. The metaphors used to talk about women emphasized fragility and beauty over any other qualities, and language shapes reality. When you are constantly described as delicate, when that is the ideal held up for you to aspire to, it affects how you see yourself and how others see you. So what can we learn from this bizarre historical moment when women were expected to perform weakness? I think there are a few things. First, that social expectations around gender are often contradictory and impossible. Women were expected to be weak and strong simultaneously, and when they failed at this impossible task, they were blamed for not trying hard enough. Second, that performance is exhausting. The emotional and physical labor of constantly pretending to be something you are not takes a toll. And third, that women have always been stronger than society wanted them to be. The real women of the Regency period were surviving and thriving despite a system designed to keep them decorative and dependent. That resilience, that hidden strength, that is worth remembering. The next time you feel pressured to perform in a way that does not feel authentic, to be softer, quieter, more accommodating than you actually feel, remember the women of 1815 fainting gracefully on command while privately running entire households. Remember that performance has a cost, and remember that you have the option to refuse the performance altogether, which is a freedom they did not have. We owe them that honesty. We owe ourselves that authenticity. But as complex as the performance of everyday femininity was, it became even more intricate when romance was involved. Because when men and women were actually courting, when feelings were engaged and futures were at stake, the rituals became even more elaborate. The gifts that were exchanged, the letters that were written, the subtle signals that were sent, all of this was governed by yet another layer of rules. And some of those rules were genuinely strange. I am talking about hair jewellery, perfume that was customized for one person only, and books with specific passages underlined as coded messages. The language of courtship in the Regency era was beautiful, bizarre, and occasionally more than a little bit creepy. Let us explore it together. When two people in Regency England wanted to express romantic interest, they could not simply text each other or slide into someone's direct messages. They had to navigate a complex system of gift-giving, letter-writing, and symbolic gestures that communicated attraction while maintaining propriety. And some of these romantic tokens were genuinely beautiful. Thoughtful books with meaningful passages marked, delicate watercolor paintings, carefully chosen flowers that spoke in the language of botany. But some of them were deeply, wonderfully, magnificently weird. We are talking about jewellery made from human hair, handkerchiefs embroidered with intertwined locks from two different people, gifts so intimate and strange that they blur the line between romantic and unsettling. Welcome to the world of Regency courtship, where love was expressed through the most creative and occasionally disturbing means imaginable. Let us start with the gifts that men gave to women, because this was overwhelmingly one-directional. The social expectation was that men pursued and women received. Men were the gift givers. Women were the grateful recipients. According to Sally Holloway, a historian at Oxford Brookes University, who has extensively studied Regency courtship, the vast majority of romantic gifts were given by men. Women did give gifts, but the onus was not so much on them to do so. This makes sense within the power dynamics of the era. Men had the money, the freedom, the agency. Women had to be more careful about what they gave and to whom, because an overly forward gift could damage their reputations. So what kinds of gifts did men give? Books were extremely popular and socially acceptable. A gentleman might give a lady a novel or a volume of poetry, perhaps with certain passages underlined or marked with a small notation in the margin. This was brilliant because it served multiple purposes. First, it was an appropriate gift that no one could criticize. Books were educational, improving, entirely proper. It gave the couple something to discuss. They could talk about the book, debate its merits, share opinions. And third, it allowed for coded communication. Holloway notes that a man might present a book saying, "Look what I have underlined on page 42, do you agree?" which was a way to test whether they were literally on the same page. Imagine receiving a book and discovering that your suitor has marked a particular love poem, or a passage about marriage and happiness, or a description of an ideal partner that seems to describe you. The book becomes a conversation, a question, a declaration, all wrapped in the socially acceptable package of literature. It is romantic and clever, and it leaves a paper trail, which is part of why we know so much about Regency courtship. People saved these books. They treasured them as mementos of their romances. Men also gave perfume, but not just any perfume. This was custom-blended perfume created specifically for one woman. A gentleman would go to a perfumer and commission a scent unique to his intended. The perfumer would blend oils and essences based on the man's description of the woman or her preferences. The resulting perfume bottle would be a one-of-a-kind gift that said, "I have thought about you carefully enough to create something that exists only for you." In an era before mass production, this kind of personalization was both more common and more meaningful than it might be today. Miniature portraits were another popular gift. These were tiny paintings, small enough to fit in a locket or be carried in a pocket. A man might commission an artist to paint his own portrait in miniature and give it to the woman he was courting. This was intensely intimate. It meant she could carry his image with her, look at him whenever she wanted, think of him when they were apart, and miniatures were expensive. Commissioning one required both money and time. It was a statement of serious intent. You did not have a miniature painted for someone you were casually interested in. This was for real courtship, real attachment. Now let us talk about the gifts that make modern people go, "Wait, what?" starting with locks of hair. Hair was one of the most symbolically important gifts in Regency courtship. Holloway explains, "A lock of hair was one of the more symbolically important gifts because it was literally cut from the body." Think about that. You're giving someone a piece of yourself. Not metaphorically, literally. A lock of your hair, cut from your head, tied with a ribbon, placed in a small envelope or locket. It was intimate in a way that other gifts were not. It was permanent, and it was intensely personal, but it gets weirder. Hair was not just given as a simple lock, it was woven into jewellery. There were professional craftspeople who specialised in hair work, creating elaborate designs from human hair, bracelets woven from the hair of a loved one, brooches featuring intricate patterns made from hair, rings with tiny compartments containing coiled hair. Some of these pieces mixed hair from multiple people, say, a mother's hair and a daughter's hair braided together. But in romantic contexts, it might be the hair of both parties in a courtship, literally intertwined. Holloway mentions a handkerchief embroidered with their hair and their suitor's hair, literally combining two bodies in a single item. Can you imagine? You embroider a handkerchief with your own hair and the hair of the person you are courting, creating a textile that literally binds you together. It is simultaneously beautiful and slightly disturbing. It is romantic and also just a tiny bit macabre. And people loved it. Hair jewellery and hair art were enormously popular throughout the Georgian and Regency periods. It was not considered weird, it was considered deeply meaningful. There is actually a whole museum in England, the Harris Museum in Preston, that has a collection of Georgian and Victorian hair jewellery. You can see bracelets, rings, necklaces, all made from or containing human hair. Some pieces are remarkably intricate, some are quite beautiful if you can get past the "this is made from dead people's body parts" factor, and many of them have romantic inscriptions: "To my dearest love, forever thine, in memory of our attachment." These were treasured possessions, worn close to the body, touched throughout the day as reminders of the person whose hair you carried. Now, what about the gifts that women gave to men? This is where things get interesting because women had to be much more careful. A woman could not give expensive or overly personal gifts without suggesting impropriety. So what could she give? Handcrafted items were safe. A woman might embroider something for her suitor, perhaps a bookmark, a handkerchief, a small decorative item. The fact that she had spent hours of labour creating it made it valuable without being inappropriately expensive. It showed thought, care and attention, and it demonstrated her domestic skills, which was important in an era when a wife's primary role was managing the household. Waistcoats were particularly interesting. A woman might make a waistcoat for a man she was courting. This was acceptable because it was both practical and required significant skill. Waistcoats were complex garments with intricate stitching. Making one proved you could sew well, which suggested you would be a competent wife. But it was also incredibly intimate. A waistcoat was worn against the body. Every time the man wore it, he would be literally wrapped in something his beloved had created. He would think of her. He would carry her work against his heart. It was a clever way to give an intimate gift that remained socially acceptable. And then there was the food. Women could give food gifts. Homemade preserves, baked goods, candied fruits. This was safe territory because it showed domestic competence without being too personal. But it also had symbolic weight. Sharing food is intimate. Preparing food for someone is an act of care. A jar of homemade preserves said, "I can nurture you. I can provide for you. I can make your life sweeter," all without saying anything directly romantic that might compromise her reputation. But the most important romantic communication happened through letters. Love letters were the primary way couples in courtship could have private conversations, and the system around letter writing was complex. Holloway explains that men had to formally request a correspondence and women accepted or declined entering this more serious stage. The request itself was a major step. It required the man to approach either the woman directly or her parents, depending on the circumstances, and ask permission to write to her. If she accepted, it was understood that the courtship was becoming serious. You did not enter into correspondence lightly. And what went into these letters? Oh, they were elaborate. Men's letters, according to Holloway, ruminated at enormous length about the nature of love, the depth of their feeling, and many included poems. Regency men were writing poetry to their sweethearts. They were waxing philosophical about the nature of affection. They were baring their souls in ways that might surprise people who think of that era as buttoned up and repressed. These letters could run to many pages. They were carefully composed, drafted and redrafted, copied out in best handwriting. They were works of art. Women's letters were different. Holloway notes that women's letters are marked by their modesty, their reserve. This does not mean they were cold or unfeeling, but women had to be careful. A letter that was too passionate, too forward, could be used against her. If the relationship ended badly, the man might share her letters, damaging her reputation. So women wrote with emotion, but also with caution. They expressed affection but maintained propriety. They had to trust that the man would read between the lines, that he would understand the depth of feeling she was carefully moderating in her words. And the letters themselves were treasured as objects. Holloway describes how you would smell it. It was perfumed. You would press your lips to it. It was something that had touched the writer's hands and then touched your hands. Letters were not just informational. They were sensory experiences. Women perfumed their letters, a hint of the same scent the man had given them perhaps. The paper quality mattered, the handwriting mattered. Everything about the letter was an extension of the person who wrote it. Receiving a letter from someone you loved was like having them there with you, at least for the moments it took to read their words. There is a beautiful collection at the British Library of Regency-era love letters between ordinary people, not famous figures, just regular folks who fell in love and wrote about it. Reading them is incredibly moving because you realize that despite all the formality, despite all the rules and restrictions, people felt the same things we feel. They longed for each other. They counted the days until they could be together. They agonized over whether their feelings were returned. They were fully human, fully feeling, just wrapped in the linguistic conventions of their time. One letter in the collection, dated 1813, is from a young man to the woman he hopes to marry. He writes about seeing her at a party and being unable to speak to her properly because there were too many people around. He describes watching her from across the room, trying to catch her eye, feeling both elated that she was there and frustrated that he could not have a real conversation with her. The longing in that letter is palpable. You can feel his frustration with the social rules that kept them apart even when they were in the same room. And then he writes, I am paraphrasing, but the sense is clear. Until I can see you again and perhaps steal a few moments of genuine conversation, I must content myself with this paper substitute, knowing that your hands will touch what my hands have touched, and perhaps that is a kind of connection until we meet again. It is achingly romantic. But here is the risk that came with love letters. They were evidence. If you wrote passionate letters to someone and the engagement was broken off for any reason, those letters could come back to haunt you. A jilted man might publish a woman's letters to embarrass her or pressure her into reconsidering. A vengeful woman might share a man's letters to damage his reputation, though this was rarer because women had less social power. There are actual historical cases of love letters being used in breach of promise lawsuits. The letters proved that a relationship existed, that promises were made. They were romantic, yes, but they were also legally significant documents. This is why some women were cautious about what they committed to paper. And it is why some men were careful too. You were creating a record of your feelings, your promises, your most intimate thoughts. That record could be cherished forever in a happy marriage, or it could be weaponized if things went wrong. The vulnerability of putting your heart on paper was real. Let me tell you about one more type of gift that straddles the line between romantic and practical: silhouettes. These were profile portraits cut from black paper, showing just the outline of a person's face. They were much cheaper than miniature paintings, but still personal and meaningful. A man might have his silhouette cut and give it to his beloved, or they might have silhouettes made together at a fair or entertainment. Silhouettes were democratic. You did not need to be wealthy to afford one, but they were still intimate. Still a way of saying, I want you to have my image. I want you to remember my face when I am not with you. Have you ever received a gift that felt like it captured something essential about your relationship with someone? That felt chosen with such care that it communicated things words could not. That is what the best of these Regency courtship gifts were like. Yes, some of them seem strange to us now, the hair jewellery especially, but in their context they made perfect sense. They were ways of saying, you matter to me, I am thinking of you, I am investing time, money, thought into expressing my feelings for you. The specific form might change across centuries, but that underlying impulse, that is universal. So the next time you're trying to figure out what gift to give someone you care about, remember that the thought behind it matters more than the cost or the trendiness. Remember that personalization, choosing something specifically for this person, has always been meaningful, and maybe be grateful that you can express affection without having to weave anyone's hair into jewellery. Because honestly, as romantic as it was in context, it is also just a little bit creepy by modern standards. But as elaborate as the courtship ritual was, it was only the beginning. Once two people became engaged, a whole new set of rules kicked in, and even engaged couples, even people who had formally committed to spending their lives together, had to navigate restrictions that seem almost unbelievable today. You still needed chaperones, you still could not be alone together, you still had to perform perfect propriety, even though you were literally planning to get married. The engagement period was its own special form of torture, full of rules designed to test your patience and your commitment. And that's exactly where we are heading next, into the strange world of being engaged, but not quite free, promised but not yet united, and all the bizarre behaviours that were expected of couples who were supposed to be in love, but not allowed to show it too much. You have done it. He has proposed, you have accepted, your families approve, the engagement has been announced. You are officially betrothed, promised to each other, planning your future together. Surely now, finally, you can relax. You can spend time together without all the ridiculous restrictions. You can have actual conversations without someone hovering 3 feet away. You can hold hands, perhaps even steal a kiss when no one is looking, right? Wrong. So wonderfully, frustratingly, absurdly wrong. Because in Regency England, engagement did not grant you freedom. It granted you a slightly different set of restrictions. You were still under surveillance, still performing propriety, still following rules that seemed designed to keep you and your beloved as far apart as possible, even though you were literally planning to spend the rest of your lives together. The Etiquette Guide, Cassell's household guide, published in the Victorian period but reflecting attitudes that carried over from the Regency, is very clear about this. It states that even after engagement, the lady still needed chaperones with her, as she was never to go out alone with her fiancé. Think about that. You've publicly committed to marrying this person. Your families have agreed. The banns might be being read in church, and you still cannot take a walk together without a third person trailing behind you. You're engaged, but you're not trusted. The implication is clear. Even an engaged couple might do something improper if left unsupervised. The wedding night was the magic threshold after which you could finally be alone together. Until then, chaperone city, but it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. The guide continues. Furthermore, the couple must not retreat from a group to whisper together, or do anything to excite smiles and comments from others. So not only do you need a chaperone, but even with other people around, you cannot have a private moment. You cannot step into a corner of the room for a quiet conversation. You cannot murmur something intimate to each other at a party. Because if you do, people will notice. People will smile knowingly. People will make comments. And according to Cassell's, this absurd behaviour is a violation of propriety. The guide literally calls it absurd while also insisting you must not do it. Everyone knew the rules were ridiculous, but you still had to follow them. And here is my personal favourite restriction. It was considered excessively vulgar for an engaged woman to clasp her hand on her fiancé's arm. Excessively vulgar. To touch the arm of the man you are planning to marry. The man whose children you will bear, whose home you will manage, whose life will be entirely intertwined with yours. But touching his arm in public? Scandalous, vulgar, utterly inappropriate. The logic here is baffling. You can dance with him, that involves holding hands and touching quite a bit. But casually resting your hand on his arm as you walk together, that crosses a line apparently. So what could you do? How could engaged couples spend time together within these suffocating restrictions? Well, you could sit in your family's drawing room with your chaperone present and make polite conversation. You could attend social events together, but you had to interact with other people as well, not just each other. You could dance together at balls, but only the allowed number of dances, 2 at most, even if you were engaged. Dancing more than twice with the same person suggested you were too attached, too focused on each other, not properly sociable. Even engaged couples were expected to spread their social attention around. The engagement period itself had a recommended duration. According to Cassels, 12 months was the recommended engagement period. A full year. Why so long? Partly practical, planning a wedding, assembling a trousseau, arranging the household took time, but partly it was a test. The thinking was that if you could maintain your attachment for a full year, while seeing each other only in heavily chaperoned, highly restricted circumstances, then you probably had a solid foundation for marriage. But the guide also notes, rather cynically, that people who think a long engagement helps them know each other better are just as liable to be deceived as those who marry after a hasty courtship. So the year-long engagement was simultaneously required and acknowledged as possibly pointless, just in case you needed more evidence that none of this made much sense. Let us talk about what happened at social events, specifically balls, because this is where the restrictions took on a particularly choreographed quality. Enter the dance card. Have you ever seen these in historical films? They are little booklets, often attached to a ribbon that women would wear on their wrists. Inside there is a list of dances planned for the evening, and next to each dance there is a blank space where the woman would write the name of her partner for that dance. The dance card was essentially your social schedule for the evening, planned out in advance. But the dance card was not just organisational, it was political, it was strategic, it was a way of broadcasting your social standing and your romantic attachments, or lack thereof. If your dance card filled up quickly, it meant you were popular, desirable, sought after. If you had empty spaces, it meant you were being overlooked, and everyone could see. People would literally ask to see your dance card to check who you were dancing with. It was like your Instagram engagement metrics made visible and public for everyone to judge. The rules around dance cards were specific. A woman could not dance more than twice with the same man unless they were engaged or closely related. Even if she wanted to dance every dance with her fiancé, she could not. It would be improper. It would suggest they were too wrapped up in each other, too exclusive, not sufficiently social. So even at a ball, even in a romantic setting with music and beautiful clothes and the perfect atmosphere for connection, engaged couples had to ration their time together. 2 dances. That was it. The rest of the evening you danced with other people while watching your beloved dance with others. It must have been maddening. And here is where it gets really interesting. The strategic importance of the dance card meant that some women played games with it. A woman might deliberately not write a man's name down for a dance he had requested, saving that spot for someone more desirable who might ask later. Or she might fill her card early, leaving no spaces for men she wanted to avoid. The dance card became a tool of social maneuvering. You could reject someone without having to verbally reject them. "Oh, I am so sorry, but my card is full." It was the equivalent of, "I have to wash my hair that night" as an excuse, but formalised and acceptable. Men too had to navigate the dance card system carefully. You could not ask for too many dances with one woman. It suggested intentions that you might not have, or that might not be welcome. But you also could not ask. Failing to dance with someone you had danced with previously could be seen as a slight. And you had to time your request right. Ask too early, and she might prefer to save dances for someone else. Ask too late and her card might be full. It was social chess played on a dance floor. Now let us talk about something completely different but equally revealing. Taking French leave. This is one of my favourite bits of Regency etiquette because it is so practical and yet still wrapped in formality. Taking French leave meant leaving a party or dinner early without making a big fuss about it. The etiquette guides actually recommended this practice. If you had to leave before an event ended, maybe you had another commitment, maybe you were unwell, maybe you were just bored, you were supposed to do it quietly. You would catch your host's or hostess's eye, make a small gesture of apology, and slip out. No grand farewells, no drawing attention to yourself, no interrupting the flow of the party. The reasoning was considerate, actually. If you made a big production of leaving, you might inspire other guests to leave as well. Your departure could break up the party prematurely. So the polite thing was to actually ghost in physical space, just quietly remove yourself. You would send a note the next day apologizing and explaining, but in the moment you just faded away. I love this because it is one of the few Regency etiquette rules that prioritizes group harmony over individual recognition. Most rules were about making sure you were seen doing the right thing. French leave was about not being seen at all. Can you imagine trying this at a modern party? Just silently slipping out without saying goodbye to anyone? Your friends would think you'd been kidnapped, but in the Regency era, it was not just acceptable, it was preferred. As long as you sent that apologetic note the next day, all was forgiven. The host would understand. You had other obligations. Life was complicated. No hard feelings. But back to our engaged couple, suffering through their year-long supervised courtship. One of the few freedoms they had was correspondence. Once you were engaged, letter writing became more relaxed. You could write to each other more frequently, more intimately. The letters did not have to be checked by parents, though some families still insisted on this. And the content could be more personal. You could discuss your future together. You could express affection more openly. The letters became a private space where you could actually be yourselves, away from the constant surveillance of chaperones and society. There are collections of engagement letters from this period that are genuinely touching. People used these letters to have the conversations they could not have in person. They discussed what kind of household they wanted to create. They talked about their hopes and fears. They reassured each other during the long, frustrating wait until they could marry. One collection at the Bodleian Library includes letters between a couple engaged in 1817. The man writes about how difficult it is to sit in her family's drawing room, having stilted conversations with her mother present, when all he wants is to really talk to her. He writes, and I am paraphrasing from memory, "These public moments are torture because you are so near and yet so far. I must content myself with watching you across the room and saving all my real thoughts for these letters, which at least reach you in private." The waiting was hard. The restrictions were hard. And engagement could be broken off if circumstances changed. This was not common, but it happened. If financial situations shifted dramatically, if scandals emerged, if one party simply changed their mind, engagements could be ended. This created additional anxiety. You had committed publicly, but until you were actually married, there was still uncertainty. And if an engagement was broken, there was often social and even legal fallout. We talked earlier about breach of promise lawsuits. These were real. If a man broke an engagement without sufficient cause, the woman's family could sue for damages. If a woman broke it, the man could sue. The engagement period was legally binding in ways that modern engagements are not. So let us talk about the actual wedding. After a year of frustration and surveillance, you finally get married. The ceremony is relatively brief. Church of England weddings in this period were simple affairs compared to modern extravaganzas. There was no walking down the aisle to dramatic music, no first dance, no reception line. You showed up at the church, often quite early in the morning. Fashionable weddings might happen at 10 or 11 a.m. You said your vows before the priest and a few witnesses, and then you were married. Done. The wedding breakfast followed, which, despite the name, was more of a lunch. This was held at the bride's family home and was the closest thing to a reception. There would be food, toasts, some celebration, but it was nothing like the elaborate multi-hour wedding receptions we have today. And then the couple would depart for their honeymoon, or more likely for the groom's estate or family home. And finally they could be alone together without a chaperone. After months or a year of being constantly supervised, they suddenly had privacy. It must have been both exciting and genuinely awkward. You'd been trained so thoroughly to never be alone together that suddenly being alone must have felt strange. Think about what this means for intimate relationships. Most couples went into marriage barely knowing each other, beyond surface-level conversation and heavily supervised encounters. The engagement period, which could have been a time to really get to know each other, was so restricted that it served that purpose only minimally. People were marrying near strangers and then suddenly expected to be intimate partners in every way. It's no wonder that conduct books of the era devoted so much attention to the duty of marriage. People needed instruction because they had been given no opportunity to figure things out naturally. But somehow people managed. Many Regency marriages were happy. Many couples genuinely loved each other. They figured it out. They learned each other. They built lives together, despite the bizarre system that had kept them apart for so long. And that resilience, that human ability to create connection even within constraining systems, is kind of beautiful. People have always found ways to love each other, no matter what obstacles society puts in their path. So the next time you are frustrated with modern dating, the unclear expectations, the ghosting, the ambiguity, remember that at least you can actually spend time alone with someone you're interested in. You can have real conversations without a chaperone taking notes. You can touch their arm without being considered vulgar. You can leave a party whenever you want without sending an apologetic note the next day. And if you get engaged, you can actually get to know each other before the wedding. Those freedoms are enormous. They are gifts, and they are worth appreciating. But our journey through Regency social rules would not be complete without looking at what happened when all of these elaborate rules collided with real life and real people. Because rules are one thing, but humans are messy. Passions flare, mistakes are made, scandals erupt, and when the carefully constructed facade of propriety cracks, the results can be spectacular, tragic, and occasionally darkly comic. That is where we are heading in our final chapter together, into the real scandals that rocked Regency society and showed that underneath all the politeness and protocol, people were just as messy, dramatic, and human as we are today. All of these rules, the bowing, the calling cards, the chaperones, the performance of delicacy, they were designed to create order, to prevent scandal, to keep society running smoothly along predictable tracks. But people are not machines. We are emotional, impulsive, passionate, flawed. And when human nature crashed into rigid social rules, the results were sometimes explosive. Let me take you through some of the most notorious etiquette disasters and scandals of the Regency period. These are real stories of real people who broke the rules, some intentionally, some accidentally, and whose lives were forever changed by those choices. These stories show us that underneath all the propriety, all the formal politeness, people in 1815 were just as messy and complicated as we are today. Let us start with perhaps the most famous scandal of the entire Regency era, Lady Caroline Lamb and Lord Byron. If the Regency period had tabloids, these two would have dominated every cover. Lady Caroline was married to William Lamb, who would later become Prime Minister. She was witty, intelligent, unconventional, and prone to dramatic gestures. Lord Byron was the rock star of his age, A brilliant poet, devastatingly handsome, brooding and dangerous, and absolutely magnetic. When they met in 1812, the attraction was immediate and mutual, and Lady Caroline did something that violated virtually every rule we have discussed. She pursued him openly, passionately, and very, very publicly. She sent him letters, lots of letters. She showed up at his residence uninvited. She engineered encounters at social events and then monopolized his attention, ignoring other guests, ignoring her husband, ignoring every single rule about how a married woman should behave. People noticed. Of course people noticed. This was exactly the kind of behavior that was designed to be noticed, and Caroline knew it. She famously wrote in her diary that Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And then she pursued a relationship with him anyway. The affair was scandalous, not just because it happened, but because Caroline refused to hide it. She violated the fundamental rule of Regency society, discretion. Remember how we talked about married women being able to take lovers as long as they were quiet about it? Caroline was not quiet. She was the opposite of quiet. She once showed up at a ball dressed as a page boy in men's clothing to get Byron's attention. She sent him locks of her hair. She wrote him poetry. She made scenes. When Byron tried to end the affair, she became even more dramatic, threatening suicide, showing up at his home, refusing to accept that it was over. The Ton was scandalized, not necessarily because she was having an affair. Plenty of married women had affairs, but because she was making it impossible to ignore. She was forcing society to acknowledge something they all preferred to politely overlook. Her husband was humiliated. Her family was horrified. And Caroline became a social pariah. Invitations dried up, people cut her at social events. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had made her private indiscretion public, and society could not forgive that. The aftermath was tragic. Caroline's mental health deteriorated. She became increasingly erratic and isolated. Byron left England partly to escape the scandal. Caroline eventually wrote a novel, Glaven, that was a thinly veiled account of their affair, which only made things worse. She spent her final years largely ostracized from the society she had once been part of. Her story became a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you refuse to follow the rules. This is the price of public scandal. Now let us talk about an even bigger scandal, one that involved the highest levels of society. The disastrous marriage of Princess Caroline of Brunswick to the Prince Regent, who would become King George IV. This was not a story of passionate rule-breaking. This was a story of what happened when the rules were followed, but the people involved were utterly incompatible. The marriage was arranged for political and financial reasons. The prince needed money. Caroline had connections. They met for the first time just days before their wedding in 1795, and it was a disaster from the first moment. The prince reportedly took one look at Caroline and asked for a glass of brandy. She looked at him and was similarly unimpressed. But the rules of royal marriage meant they had to go through with it anyway. They married. They produced an heir, Princess Charlotte, and then they essentially separated, though not officially. They could not divorce. Royal divorces were nearly impossible. So they lived separately and increasingly publicly despised each other. What makes this relevant to our discussion of etiquette is how the breakdown played out in public. The prince and princess were supposed to maintain a facade of civility. Royal couples, even unhappy ones, were expected to perform unity for the sake of the monarchy. But Caroline refused. She lived openly with other men. She travelled to Italy and behaved in ways that shocked even the relatively relaxed Italian society. She wore revealing clothes. She threw wild parties. She essentially rejected every rule about how a princess should behave. The prince retaliated by trying to divorce her on grounds of adultery. He commissioned an investigation, the delicate investigation, that questioned servants and acquaintances about Caroline's behaviour. The investigation found evidence of impropriety, but not quite enough for divorce. So the situation dragged on, getting messier and more public. By 1820, when the prince finally became King George IV, Caroline returned to England and demanded to be recognised as queen. The public loved her. She had become a symbol of resistance against an unpopular king. But society was torn. Could you acknowledge Caroline without insulting the king? Could you cut Caroline without seeming to side with her awful husband? This is where we see the cutting system really tested. The king made it clear anyone who acknowledged Caroline would be cut by the royal family. Major aristocrats had to choose sides. Some cut Caroline, some continued to acknowledge her. Society fractured along these lines. It was the biggest social crisis of the Regency era, precisely because it pitted the rules against each other. The rule of respecting royalty versus the rule of showing compassion to a wronged woman. There was no good answer. Caroline tried to attend the king's coronation in 1821. She was turned away at the door of Westminster Abbey. The humiliation was total and public. She died a few weeks later, possibly from an overdose of laudanum, possibly from illness exacerbated by stress. Her funeral procession through London drew massive crowds. The people loved her, even if society had rejected her. It was a scandal that showed the limitations and cruelty of the social rules we have been discussing. Let me tell you about a smaller scandal, but one that I find particularly revealing. Harriet Wilson. She was a courtesan, a woman who made her living as the mistress of wealthy men. This was not uncommon. What was uncommon was what she did in 1825. She decided to publish her memoirs, and not gentle, discreet memoirs, detailed, name-naming, scandal-revealing memoirs. She wrote about all of her affairs, identified the men involved, described intimate details, and before publishing she contacted these men and offered them a choice. Pay her to be left out of the book or be exposed. This was social blackmail on a grand scale, and it worked. Many men paid. But many refused, either because they could not afford her price or because they hoped she was bluffing. She was not bluffing. The memoirs were published and became an immediate sensation. They sold out instantly. Everyone wanted to read about the secret lives of the aristocracy. The men who were named were humiliated. Their families were scandalized. Some marriages ended. Reputations were destroyed. What makes this fascinating is that Harriet had broken multiple rules. She had violated discretion. She had made private matters public. She had betrayed confidences. But she could not be punished through normal social channels because she was already outside society. You cannot cut someone who was never really included in the first place. The men she exposed faced consequences. She became wealthy and, in a weird way, celebrated. Her memoirs are still in print today. You can read them. They are witty, sharp, and absolutely devastating to the men she describes. Harriet's story shows something important. The rules only worked when everyone agreed to follow them. Someone who refused to play the game, who was willing to be ostracized, could sometimes wield significant power. The threat of exposure, of scandal, of having your private indiscretions made public, that threat only worked if you cared about your position in society. Harriet did not care. She had nothing to lose, and that made her dangerous. Now, not all etiquette disasters were about sex and scandal. Some were about violence. Remember how we talked about duels? Dueling was illegal in Regency England, but it still happened regularly. And duels were often the result of perceived etiquette violations. If a man felt his honour had been insulted, if he had been cut, if rumours had been spread, if his character had been questioned, he could challenge the offender to a duel. This was the ultimate escalation of an etiquette dispute. Words failed, so we resort to pistols at dawn. The most famous duel of the era was probably between the Duke of Wellington and the Earl of Winchelsea in 1829. The Earl had publicly questioned the Duke's honour and integrity. Wellington, who had commanded British forces at Waterloo and was serving as Prime Minister, felt he had no choice but to challenge Winchelsea to a duel. They met in Battersea Fields early one morning. Wellington fired first, deliberately missing. Winchelsea fired into the air. Honour was satisfied. Apologies were made, no one was hurt, but the point was made. Even the Prime Minister would defend his reputation with potential violence. Duels show us how high the stakes were. An insult was not just an insult. Breach of etiquette was not just rude. These things could escalate to life or death situations. The social rules were backed by the implicit threat of violence. Men knew that if they insulted someone badly enough, they might have to face them with weapons. This added weight to every interaction. It made the rules feel more serious, more consequential. But here is something interesting. Women could not duel. They had no recourse to violence to defend their honour. So how did women fight back when they were insulted or wronged? They used the social weapons available to them. Cutting, gossip, social exclusion, letters, public scenes. These were women's tools in a world that did not allow them more direct forms of conflict. And in some ways, these tools were more effective than dueling. A duel was over in minutes, but a woman's campaign of social destruction could last years and ruin someone completely without a single shot being fired. Let me tell you about one more scandal, a quieter one but equally revealing. In 1816, a young woman, I will not use her real name because her family descendants might still exist, attended her first major ball of the season. She was nervous, excited, determined to make a good impression. She had practiced her curtsies. She had rehearsed her small talk. She was ready. And then she made a mistake, a simple human mistake. She accidentally called a titled lady by the wrong name. It seems like such a small thing. But in that moment, in front of dozens of witnesses, it marked her as someone who did not know the peerage well enough to get it right. It suggested her family was not well connected. It revealed her as an outsider trying to fit in. And society pounced. People whispered. The story spread. Did you hear about the girl who called Lady So-and-so by the wrong name? Can you imagine? She became known for that mistake. It defined her first season. She received fewer invitations, she was treated with less respect. And according to family records that survived, she made only a mediocre marriage to a man whose family was similarly on the social margins. One mistake, one wrong name, and her trajectory changed. This story breaks my heart because it shows how unforgiving the system was. There was no room for human error, no grace for nervousness or honest mistakes. You had to be perfect always in every interaction. And if you were not, society would remember, society would judge, society would punish. So what can we learn from these disasters and scandals? What do these stories tell us about the Regency world we have been exploring together? First, that the rules were real and the consequences were serious. These were not just quaint customs, they were the structure that held society together, and breaking them could destroy lives. Second, that people pushed back. Caroline Lamb refused to be discreet. Caroline of Brunswick refused to disappear quietly. Harriet Wilson refused to protect the men who had used her. These women, flawed, messy, complicated women, rejected the rules and paid various prices for that rejection. Some were destroyed, some were liberated, but they all showed that the system was not unbreakable. Third, that underneath all the formality, people were people. They fell in love with the wrong people, they made mistakes, they gossiped and schemed and hurt each other. The elaborate etiquette was supposed to prevent this, to smooth over human messiness with polite behavior. But it could not. Human nature is stronger than any social rule. People will always find ways to be their full, complicated, passionate selves, even when society demands otherwise. And finally, that we should be grateful for the freedoms we have. Yes, modern social life is confusing. Yes, the rules are unclear. Yes, you never quite know if you're doing it right. But you also cannot be socially destroyed for using someone's first name or forgetting a title. You cannot be ostracized for touching someone's arm. You cannot be cut from society for calling at the wrong hour. The stakes are so much lower now. The margin for error is so much wider. And that is a gift. That is progress. That is something worth appreciating. As we come to the end of our journey through the strange, wonderful, absurd world of Regency social rules, I hope you feel what I feel. A mixture of fascination and relief. Fascination at how intricate and bizarre the whole system was. Relief that we do not have to live in it. The people of 1815 created this elaborate structure to manage social interaction, to maintain order, to keep everyone in their proper place. And it worked, after a fashion. But it also created anxiety, stifled individuality, and made every social interaction a potential minefield. We have covered so much ground together tonight. From the terror of introductions to the power of cutting, from the exhaustion of walking while talking to the surveillance of chaperones, from the stress of dinner parties to the intimacy of first names, from the precision of bowing to the complexity of calling cards, from the performance of weakness to the strangeness of courtship gifts, from the restrictions of engagement to the drama of real scandals. It has been quite a journey through the social landscape of the past. And the truth is, these stories matter. Not just because they are entertaining, though I hope you have been entertained, but because they remind us that social rules are human constructions. They change, they evolve, they can be challenged and reimagined. The people of the Regency era thought their way of doing things was natural, eternal, obviously correct. We look back and see how arbitrary and often cruel those rules were. What does that tell us about our own social rules? What are we doing today that future generations will look back on and think was absurd? Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring these strange and fascinating rules that once governed every moment of social life. Thank you for your patience as we waded through the complexity, for your curiosity about this strange historical world, and for being here with me on this journey into the past. I hope you found something in these stories that surprised you, that made you laugh, that made you think. If you enjoyed this exploration of Regency social survival, please let me know in the comments. Tell me which rule you found most bizarre, which scandal you found most shocking, which part of this whole elaborate system you are most grateful we no longer have to deal with. Your thoughts and reactions mean so much to me. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe take a moment to appreciate the freedom you have, the freedom to call people by their first names, the freedom to walk down the street without performing choreography, the freedom to have conversations without someone taking notes, the freedom to touch someone's arm without being considered vulgar. These small freedoms, these casual liberties, they were hard-won. They represent generations of people pushing back against restrictive rules, demanding more autonomy, more authenticity, more room to be human. Sleep well, my friends, and I will see you very soon with another story from history, another journey into the strange and wonderful ways people used to live. Until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are living in a time of unprecedented social freedom. Use it well, be kind to each other, and maybe, just maybe, appreciate that you will never have to curtsy to anyone unless you really want to. Good night.